My name is Savannah and I am 33 years old. My husband is a covert agent for the CIA, but his elite family thinks he is just a corporate consultant. At their lavish summer reunion, he suddenly snatched a crystal glass right out of my hand. "Do not touch anything else," he whispered, his voice dangerously low. I thought he was being overly protective until he stared at the cloudy residue at the bottom and asked a question that made my blood run cold. "You really did not see who handed you that?" Before I tell you how this single poisoned glass led to the greatest takedown in high society history, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever outsmarted toxic in-laws who thought you were just an easy target. For 5 years, I had endured the Hawthorne family gatherings. They were a dynasty of generational wealth, old money, that controlled real estate and politicians. Tonight was their grand summer gala at their sprawling Hamptons estate. It was a $30 million oceanfront property with manicured hedges and an imposing iron gate that separated their pristine world from the rest of humanity. I stood near a towering ice sculpture, feeling entirely out of place in a sea of custom gowns and inherited diamonds. I had grown up in the foster care system, bouncing from group homes to cramped apartments, a harsh reality the Hawthorns never let me forget. My sister-in-law, Camilla, glided toward me through the crowded room. She was 30 years old, dressed in a shimmering silver gown that cost more than my first car. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a smile that never quite reached her cold blue eyes. She held out a crystal champagne flute toward me. "Drink up, Savannah," she purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You look like you could use a little liquid courage tonight. We are glad Liam convinced you to crawl out of your little home office." I reached for the delicate glass, eager for anything that might make the suffocating atmosphere more tolerable. "Thank you, Camilla," I replied, bringing the rim toward my lips. The pale champagne bubbled cheerfully. Just as the cold glass touched my bottom lip, a large hand clamped around my wrist. Liam appeared beside me, seemingly out of nowhere. His grip was tight enough to startle me, but gentle enough not to spill a drop. He pulled the glass away with a swift, fluid motion. "Liam, what are you doing?" I asked, rubbing my wrist and looking at him in confusion. He did not answer immediately. His dark eyes were locked on the bottom of the crystal flute. He tilted it slightly under the bright chandelier light, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. He stepped closer, positioning his broad shoulders to completely block us from the view of the surrounding guests. "Do not touch anything else in this house," he whispered, his tone stripped of the affable charm he usually wore. This was the voice of a man trained to assess mortal danger. I stared at him, bewildered. I thought he was joking, perhaps trying to save me from his family's notoriously strong cocktails. But his expression was deadly serious. "You really did not see who handed you that?" he asked, his gaze scanning the room with terrifying precision. "Camilla just gave it to me," I murmured, feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the cool ocean breeze coming through the open terrace doors. Before I could ask anything else, Liam reached into his tailored suit jacket. With practiced invisible movements, he produced a tiny glass vial. He tipped the champagne flute, allowing a few drops of the cloudy residue from the bottom to fall into the small container. He capped it instantly and slid it back into his pocket, setting the nearly full glass on a passing waiter's tray. "We need to leave," he said softly, placing a firm hand on my back. "Right now." Liam capped the tiny vial and slipped it into the inner pocket of his tuxedo, keeping the sample secure against his chest. He set the untouched champagne flute onto a passing waiter's tray and immediately shifted closer to me. The change in him was unmistakable. To everyone else, he still looked like the composed corporate consultant his family believed him to be, but I recognized the colder focus beneath the surface. This was the Liam who planned 3 moves ahead. His gaze swept across the ballroom, pausing on the exits, the cameras and the private guards positioned around the room. "We need to leave now," he murmured. "Stay beside me and do exactly what I say." I nodded, forcing my breathing to remain even. We had barely turned toward the foyer when the crowd in front of us began to part. Beatrice Hawthorne was walking directly toward us, flanked by 2 of her society friends. Before we could take a single step toward the towering mahogany doors that led to the foyer, The sea of tailored suits and designer gowns parted. It was not a polite shifting of guests. It was a deliberate yielding of space, the kind reserved exclusively for the matriarch of the Hawthorne dynasty. Beatrice Hawthorne was making her approach. At 60 years old, my mother-in-law was a terrifying vision of generational wealth and absolute authority. She wore a deep sapphire gown that moved like liquid around her. The dress was accented by a diamond necklace that likely cost more than the combined lifetime earnings of everyone I had grown up with in the foster care system. Her silver hair was styled into an immaculate and unyielding updo, and her posture was as rigid as the marble columns supporting the ballroom ceiling. She was flanked as always by a small entourage of elite society women. They were wealthy sycophants who hung on her every word and mirrored her cruel and aristocratic expressions. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. It was the instinctive bracing for impact that had become second nature over the past 5 years of my marriage to Liam. I had survived my chaotic childhood by learning to read the room, by recognizing the subtle shifts in a predator's body language before they struck. Beatrice did not need to raise her voice or throw a punch to inflict maximum damage. Her preferred weapon was public humiliation, delivered with a smile so cold it could freeze the expensive champagne in the glasses around us. Liam tightened his hand on my waist as a silent promise of solidarity, but we were already boxed in. The escape route was entirely cut off by Beatrice and her loyal court. "Well," Beatrice announced. Her voice was pitched perfectly to slice through the ambient noise of the party and ensure that at least a dozen surrounding guests could hear every single word. "Look who finally decided to step out of the shadows." She stopped a few feet from us. Her icy blue eyes raked over me from head to toe with an expression of profound distaste. She did not bother to greet her son. Her entire focus was locked onto me, her designated target. "I see you are still wearing that off-the-rack department store dress, Savannah," she said. She let out a soft and pitying sigh that was entirely theatrical. The women flanking her exchanged amused glances, their lips twitching with suppressed laughter. "I told Liam years ago that bringing home an orphan charity case would never elevate the Hawthorne family name. You simply cannot take a child out of the foster system, put her in a nice room, and expect her to understand our standard of living. Blood will always tell, my dear, and yours is tragically common." The silence that rippled outward from our small circle was deafening. Other diners and guests paused their conversations, turning their heads to witness the spectacle. This was Beatrice's absolute favorite game, the public execution of my dignity. For 5 long years I had been the designated black sheep. I was the unworthy outsider who had somehow tricked the golden heir of the Hawthorne Empire into marriage. Every holiday, every forced Sunday dinner, and every charity gala had been a minefield of backhanded compliments and outright insults. She loved to remind everyone that I had grown up with nothing. She loved pointing out that my parents were a blank space on a birth certificate, and that my existence was a permanent stain on their flawless family portrait. I stood perfectly still under the heavy weight of her cruelty and the staring eyes of the local socialites. A younger and more fragile version of myself might have crumbled under the pressure. I remembered my first Thanksgiving with this family. A very similar comment about my lack of pedigree had sent me fleeing to the guest bathroom. I had cried until my eyes were swollen and red, while Camilla, my sister-in-law, smirked from the hallway. But I was no longer that terrified 28-year-old girl who was desperate for a maternal approval I had never known. The tears had dried up years ago, and they were replaced by a hardened resolve. I had spent my entire life being underestimated, overlooked, and discarded by people who thought they were better than me. I had built my own success from the ground up. I had paid my own way through college, worked exhausting hours, and forged an identity that required absolutely no validation from the Hawthorne Trust Fund. I did not need Beatrice to accept me, and I certainly was not going to give her the satisfaction of seeing a visible wound. I took a slow and measured breath, allowing the cool logic of survival to wash over the initial sting of her hateful words. Liam shifted his weight beside me. His broad shoulders squared as he opened his mouth to defend me, but I gently squeezed his arm, signaling him to wait. This was my battle to fight. I let a serene and unbothered smile curve my lips. I looked directly into Beatrice's icy eyes, matching her steady gaze without a single flinch of intimidation. "You are absolutely right, Beatrice," I said. My voice was smooth, melodic, and perfectly audible to the waiting audience. "This dress is from a very accessible boutique. I find that true elegance comes from the person wearing the clothes, not the price tag attached to the collar. It is a terrible shame that no amount of designer fabric can disguise ugly behavior." The collective gasp from the society women was immediate. One of them actually brought a hand to her pearl necklace in absolute shock. Beatrice felt her smile freeze. The corners of her mouth tightened into a harsh and rigid line. The calculated air of superiority she projected suddenly wavered, replaced by a flash of genuine and unadulterated fury. She was accustomed to me remaining silent. She was used to me absorbing her poison and politely excusing myself to go hide. She had not anticipated a counterattack, especially not one delivered with such effortless grace in front of her most important peers. I did not raise my voice and I did not break my polite smile, but the heavy implication hung in the air between us. Across the sprawling ballroom, I caught sight of Camilla standing near the grand staircase. She was watching the exchange intently, a delicate champagne flute pressed to her lips. She was the very same woman who had handed me the poisoned drink just minutes ago. The realization that this entire family was not just emotionally toxic, but actively and physically dangerous, sent a new surge of adrenaline through my veins. This was not a simple family dispute over a cheap dress or my lack of social standing. This was a coordinated and systemic attempt to destroy me completely. Beatrice recovered her composure quickly, though her eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "You have always had a sharp tongue, Savannah," she hissed softly. "It is a common defense mechanism for those who lack proper breeding. We will see how long that arrogance lasts." Liam stepped firmly in front of me, completely breaking his mother and her line of sight. "We are done here," he stated. His tone carried the absolute and unforgiving authority of a man who dealt with international terrorists for a living. "Savannah and I are leaving." He did not wait for her response, nor did he offer any polite farewells to the gaping guests who were still watching us. He turned his back on the powerful matriarch of the Hawthorne family. His hand gripped mine with a fierce and protective urgency as he pulled me toward the massive double doors of the foyer. I kept my head held high as we walked away from the whispering crowd. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I matched his rapid pace. The luxurious surroundings of the estate blurred around me, replaced by the sharp instinct to survive. We were walking away from the social humiliation, but the real battle was only just beginning. Liam kept his hand pressed firmly against the small of my back as he guided me through the dense crowd of socialites and politicians. His touch was usually a source of comfort, a gentle reassurance that we were navigating this toxic environment together as equals. Tonight, however, his grip was rigid and unyielding. He leaned his head down, bringing his lips close to my ear. His words were clipped precise and laced with a cold warning. He murmured that the residue he had spotted in my champagne glass was not a harmless mistake or a simple mixing error from the bartender. He told me that someone had deliberately tampered with the drink Camilla had handed me. "We are leaving right this second," he instructed, his voice barely audible over the swelling music of the live orchestra. "Keep your head down and smile. If anyone stops us, you are simply feeling faint from the summer heat and need to get some fresh air. Do not look panicked, but do not stop walking." I nodded slowly, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. I had spent the last 5 years perfecting the art of hiding my true emotions from the Hawthorne family. Masking my fear now was just another performance. I let a polite, apologetic smile curve my lips as we wove past groups of wealthy guests. The grand ballroom was a dazzling ocean of silk gowns and blinding diamond jewelry. The air was thick with the scent of heavy floral perfumes and the low hum of privileged conversations. To everyone else, this was just another flawless summer gala hosted by one of the most powerful families in the country. But underneath the glittering facade, I could feel the atmosphere shifting. Liam was not just walking me toward the exit. He was executing a calculated tactical maneuver. His eyes, usually warm and inviting, were now dark and predatory. Scanning the room with the specialized expertise of a highly trained covert operative, he was mapping out the physical space, calculating angles, and assessing potential threats with terrifying speed. He subtly altered our path, steering me away from the large glass patio doors that led to the east terrace. He whispered that 2 private security guards had deliberately moved to block the exit. Normally, the Hawthorne security team operated like ghosts. They were discreet men in dark suits who blended seamlessly into the background architecture of the estate. Tonight, their movements were coordinated, aggressive, and highly visible to anyone trained to notice. I realized with a sudden icy shock that the danger we were facing did not just come from Camilla and her poisoned glass, or from Beatrice and her cruel public insults. The entire security apparatus of the sprawling estate had been compromised or given new hostile orders. My heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to remain steady, matching Liam step for step. We moved out of the main ballroom and entered the long, lavish corridor that connected the entertaining wings to the front of the house. We passed by a group of state senators who were laughing loudly over imported cigars. We walked beneath the towering grand staircase where generations of Hawthorne family portraits stared down at us from the walls. Their painted eyes seemed to follow our every move with silent judgment. The sheer scale of the mansion suddenly felt less like a symbol of extreme wealth and more like the walls of a gilded cage. They were accustomed to controlling everything within their domain, and they did not take kindly to anything that threatened their absolute authority. We finally cleared the long corridor and stepped into the grand foyer. The space was breathtakingly massive, illuminated by a crystal chandelier that cast bright light across the stone floor. The main entrance stood straight ahead. It consisted of towering double doors made of solid, heavy wood with thick, ornate glass panels. Through the I could clearly see the wide circular driveway outside. A line of luxury vehicles waited under the glow of the outdoor lamps. Valet attendants in crisp uniforms were rushing back and forth to assist departing guests. The cool, fresh night air was just a few feet away. A wave of immense relief washed over my chest. We were almost out. We were seconds away from slipping into our car and leaving this nightmare behind us forever. Liam reached out with his friend, his long fingers wrapping firmly around the heavy brass handle of the front door. He pushed down, throwing his weight forward to swing the heavy wood outward and lead us to safety. Before the door could even open a fraction of an inch, a jarring mechanical screech shattered the quiet elegance of the foyer. The sound was harsh, metallic, and completely out of place in such a meticulously maintained and luxurious home. I looked through the glass panels and watched in absolute horror as the massive iron gates at the far perimeter of the estate began to move. These gates were 3 meters high, forged from solid black iron, and they typically remained wide open during large events. Now they were swinging inward with terrifying, unnatural speed. They met in the center of the driveway with a deafening crash that vibrated through the solid ground and rattled the glass in the front doors right in front of my face. A loud and sharp electronic beep pierced the night air, signaling that the heavy-duty magnetic locks had fully engaged. Outside, the valet attendants stopped in their tracks, looking around in total confusion. The escape route was now entirely sealed. We were locked inside the compound. Liam immediately dropped his hand from the brass door handle. His body language shifted from urgent to defensive in a single heartbeat. He pulled me slightly behind him, instinctively placing his broad shoulders between me and the rest of the house. The ambient classical music piping gently through the hidden overhead speakers abruptly cut off. A sharp burst of static filled the sudden silence, causing several guests lingering in the nearby hallways to jump and look up at the ceiling in surprise. A voice boomed through the entire estate. It was Harrison Hawthorne, my 62-year-old father-in-law. His voice was amplified to a deafening volume, echoing off the marble walls and vibrating against the high ceilings. He did not sound like the jovial host cheerfully greeting politicians earlier in the evening. His tone was cold, authoritative, and utterly ruthless. It was the voice of a man who ruled a corporate empire and crushed anyone who dared to stand in his way. "Ladies and gentlemen, Harrison announced over the microphone, his voice dripping with an eerie, calculated calmness. I sincerely apologize for the sudden interruption to our beautiful evening. Please do not be alarmed, but the estate security system has just been fully activated. We are currently under a complete lockdown. No one under any circumstances is permitted to leave the premises. I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. I looked up at Liam, whose jaw was clenched so tightly it looked carved from solid stone. He kept his eyes locked on the hallway behind us, waiting for the inevitable threat to emerge. We have a crucial family matter to settle. Harrison continued, his amplified voice echoing through the silent mansion like a judge delivering a death sentence. An internal purging that requires our immediate and undivided attention. Please remain calmly in the main gathering areas until this situation is entirely resolved. Thank you for your cooperation. The microphone clicked off with a sharp pop, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. The illusion of this perfect family gathering had been entirely shattered. The gates were locked, the guards were mobilized, and the Hawthorne family had just declared open war. The heavy silence in the grand foyer was broken by the rhythmic thud of approaching footsteps. I turned my head away from the locked glass doors just in time to see Preston stepping out from the shadows of the west corridor. At 38 years old, my brother-in-law was a man who wore his immense wealth like a weapon. He had inherited his father's sharp features and his mother's ruthless ambition, but he lacked the polished charm that made them so dangerous. Preston preferred brute force, and tonight he had brought backup. Two men in tactical black suits flanked him. They were not the usual polite security personnel who checked coats and directed valet traffic. These men moved with the heavy, calculated steps of seasoned mercenaries. I could clearly see the outlines of holstered firearms bulging beneath their tailored jackets. Preston halted a few feet away from us. A smug, deeply satisfied smile stretched across his face. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive tuxedo, looking at Liam and me, as if we were nothing more than trapped animals. "It is time to go upstairs," Preston said. His voice echoed slightly against the marble floor. "Father is waiting for you both in the private study. We have a rather urgent matter to discuss away from the prying eyes of our guests." Liam did not move. He kept his body positioned squarely between me and the armed guards. His stance was relaxed but ready, his center of gravity shifting in a way that told me he was mentally preparing to neutralize both men if they took another step forward. "We are not going anywhere with you, Preston," Liam replied, his voice dangerously low and steady. "Open the front gates right now." Preston let out a dry, humorless laugh. He gestured casually to the men beside him. "You are in no position to issue orders tonight, little brother. The estate is sealed. The cameras are disabled. You can either walk up those stairs with the dignity befitting your name, or these gentlemen will drag your lovely wife up there by her hair. The choice is entirely yours." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The threat was explicit and entirely real. I reached out and gently placed my hand on Liam's forearm. I could feel the coiled tension in his muscles, the sheer force of his restraint holding him back from tearing his brother apart. "We need to see what they want," I murmured, keeping my tone perfectly even. "We will go up." Liam looked down at me, his dark eyes searching my face for a fraction of a second. He read the quiet resolve in my expression and gave a barely perceptible nod. He tightened his grip on my hand, interlacing his fingers with mine. "Lead the way," Liam told his brother, his voice stripped of any familial affection. Preston smirked and turned on his heel. The two armed guards fell into step behind us, effectively boxing us in as we were marched toward the grand staircase. We ascended the sweeping marble steps, moving further away from the safety of the crowded ballroom below. The lively chatter and the string quartet music grew fainter with every step we took, eventually fading into a muffled, distant hum. The second floor of the Hawthorne estate was a restricted zone. It was a maze of private suites and executive offices, where the family conducted their most secretive business dealings. The hallway was lined with thick, sound-absorbing carpets that swallowed the sound of our footsteps. Heavy oak doors stood closed and locked on either side of us. The air up here felt dense and stifling, smelling faintly of expensive floor wax and old money. We were completely isolated. No one down in the ballroom would hear a single sound from up here no matter what happened. Preston stopped at the end of the corridor, halting in front of the massive double doors that led to Harrison's primary study. He pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped aside, gesturing for us to enter. The two guards remained stationed firmly in the hallway, their hands resting near their holsters. Liam guided me into the room, never letting go of my hand. The heavy doors clicked shut behind us, engaging with a solid metallic thud that signaled the locks turning into place. We were officially sealed inside. The study was a cavernous room, wrapped in dark mahogany paneling and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The heavy velvet curtains had been drawn tightly shut across the windows, blocking out any view of the night sky. The only light came from a few dim brass lamps scattered across the room, casting long, menacing shadows against the walls. The air was thick with the scent of aged leather-polished wood and the sharp, lingering aroma of Harrison's expensive cigars. Harrison and Beatrice were already waiting for us. They stood behind a massive antique desk at the far end of the room. The polished aristocratic masks they had worn so flawlessly down in the ballroom were completely gone. There were no polite smiles, no fake pleasantries, no pretending to be the gracious hosts of a summer gala. Their faces were stripped down to raw, predatory hostility. They looked exactly like what they truly were: ruthless billionaires who were ready to destroy a threat. Beatrice leaned her hands against the edge of the polished desk. Her sapphire gown glittered in the dim light, but her eyes were like frozen stones. She looked at me with a level of hatred that was so pure and absolute it almost took my breath away. She had finally stopped playing games. The quiet insults and the passive-aggressive jabs were over. She was ready for blood. Harrison stood tall beside his wife. His face was a mask of cold, unyielding authority. He did not look at his son. He kept his piercing gaze locked entirely on me. "You have caused a great deal of trouble for this family," Savannah Harrison stated. His voice was heavy and flat in the soundproofed room. "We welcomed you into our home. We gave you our name. We allowed you to share in our prestige. And this is how you repay our incredible generosity." I did not shrink under his glare. I kept my chin raised, meeting his hostile stare with absolute calm. "I have never asked you for anything, Harrison," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "I do not want your prestige, and I certainly do not want your generosity. What is this really about?" Harrison let out a short, contemptuous scoff. He picked up a small silver remote control from the desk. "It is about loyalty," he said coldly, "and it is about excising a cancer before it can spread any further through our legacy. We know exactly what you have been doing behind our backs. We know about the secrets you have been selling." He pressed a button on the remote. The lights in the study dimmed even further, plunging us into a heavy, oppressive gloom. A soft, mechanical hum filled the silence as a hidden panel in the ceiling slid open. A high-definition projector lowered smoothly into place. On the dark mahogany wall behind the desk, a massive white viewing screen descended with a quiet whirring sound. Liam stepped slightly in front of me, his body tense and ready to react. "What kind of sick game are you playing?" Father Liam demanded. His tone was sharp and commanding, carrying the edge of his covert training. "Turn the lights back on and open those doors. We are leaving." Harrison ignored his son completely. He pressed another button on the remote. The projector flared to life, casting a bright, harsh, rectangular beam of light across the room. The large screen on the wall illuminated instantly, throwing our shadows starkly against the closed door behind us. I stared at the glowing screen, my heart beating a rapid and heavy rhythm in my chest. A series of high-resolution digital photographs flashed onto the white surface one after another in a slow and deliberate sequence. The images were slightly grainy, captured from a distance in what appeared to be a dimly lit underground parking garage. The lighting was poor, but the subjects in the photos were highly distinguishable. The first photograph showed a woman standing next to a sleek black town car. She had my exact height, my exact build, and my exact shade of dark hair, pulled back into the exact style I wore to work every day. She was wearing a beige trench coat that looked identical to the one hanging in my front closet at home. The woman in the photo was leaning against the car, deeply engaged in conversation with a tall, broad-shouldered man whose face was obscured by the shadows. The next photograph clicked onto the screen. It was a closer shot. The woman's face was turned slightly toward the camera. It was my face. The features, the profile, the expression, they were all unmistakably mine. I felt a sudden icy jolt of adrenaline spike through my veins. I had never been to that parking garage. I had never owned a coat exactly like that one, and I had certainly never met the man in the photograph. Harrison clicked the remote again. The third image appeared larger and more detailed than the rest. It showed the man stepping out of the shadows. He was a foreign national wearing a sharp suit and carrying a heavy metal briefcase. He was holding the briefcase out, handing it directly to the woman who wore my face. The woman was reaching out to accept it. Her hand was wrapped around the handle of the briefcase, while her other hand extended a thick, sealed manila envelope toward the foreign man. I stared at the massive screen in absolute disbelief. The images were incredibly crisp and terrifyingly convincing. They looked like authentic surveillance photos captured during a highly illegal, highly secretive exchange of information and cash. Someone had meticulously crafted a visual narrative that placed me squarely in the center of a massive criminal conspiracy. I realized in that chilling moment just how far the Hawthorne family was willing to go to destroy me. Harrison stepped out from behind the massive mahogany desk. He moved with the slow, deliberate pacing of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. He picked up a silver laser pointer from his desk blotter, the bright red dot, suddenly dancing across the projected image of my face. "Do you think we are fools, Savannah?" he began. His voice dropped into a low, dangerous register that easily commanded the cavernous room. "Do you honestly believe you could infiltrate my company, use our name and steal from us without me finding out?" I stared at him. The sheer audacity of his words hung heavy and suffocating in the soundproofed study. "I have never stolen a single dime from you or your company," I said. My voice was remarkably steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "Not dimes," Beatrice corrected sharply. She stepped up to stand shoulder to shoulder with her husband, her sapphire gown glittering in the low light. "Millions. Hundreds of millions in proprietary data and trade secrets. You are nothing but a common thief who got greedy." Harrison clicked the remote again, bringing up a new slide on the massive screen. This one showed what looked like a series of bank statements, offshore wire transfers, and encrypted email logs. All of them bore my name, my personal details, and my supposed digital signature. For the past 6 months, Harrison declared, projecting his voice, as if he were addressing a boardroom of skeptical investors. "You have been using your position as a mid-level accountant to bypass our internal security protocols. You systematically downloaded highly classified investment strategies, offshore account routing numbers, and upcoming merger portfolios from the Hawthorne Fund." He pointed the red laser back at the foreign man in the previous photograph. "And then you took that stolen data and sold it to our most aggressive competitors in Eastern Europe. Corporate espionage, Savannah. Treason against the very family that put a roof over your head and food on your table." Liam let out a harsh, guttural sound of pure disgust. "This is absolute insanity," he snarled, taking a heavy step toward his father. The 2 armed guards stationed by the door instantly shifted. Their hands hovered over their holstered weapons, the leather creaking slightly in the quiet room. Liam did not even glance at them. He kept his furious gaze locked on Harrison. "You fabricated this entire thing. Savannah is a standard accountant. She does not even have the basic security clearance to access the executive servers, let alone bypass a multi-million-dollar corporate firewall." "That is exactly what she wanted us to believe," Harrison countered. His face was a mask of manufactured disappointment. "She played the role of the quiet, unremarkable wife perfectly. She used your blind affection as a shield while she siphoned our legacy out the back door. You are lying." Liam fired back, his voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal intensity. "And you are going to delete this garbage right now." "The evidence is right in front of you, Liam," Beatrice practically shouted. Her aristocratic composure was cracking just enough to reveal the desperate malice underneath. "Open your eyes and look at who you married. We have the transaction logs. We have the surveillance photos. We have undeniable proof that she is a traitor." I did not look at Beatrice. I did not look at Harrison. I turned my attention back to the massive projection screen on the wall. I forced my breathing to slow deliberately, pushing past the initial wave of panic that threatened to cloud my judgment. I needed to look at this not as a terrified daughter-in-law, but as the senior forensic accountant I actually was. I narrowed my eyes, dissecting the image pixel by pixel. At first glance, the photograph was terrifyingly flawless. The lighting in the underground parking garage was appropriately dim, and my features were rendered with startling clarity. But as I stared at the way the harsh overhead fluorescent light hit the beige trench coat, I noticed the first subtle flaw. The shadow cast by my jawline was falling at a 45-degree angle to the right, but the shadow cast by the stiff collar of the coat was dropping straight down. In a physical, three-dimensional space, the lighting physics simply did not match up. I looked closer at the foreign man handing over the metal briefcase. The area where his thick fingers wrapped around the handle was slightly blurred. It was a subtle distortion that did not align with the crisp, high-definition focus of his suit sleeve. The edges of my own projected silhouette seemed just a fraction too sharp against the grainy, poorly lit background of the concrete pillars. A cold realization washed over me. This was not a cheap photo manipulation patched together by a desperate private investigator. This was deepfake technology, and it was incredibly sophisticated. Someone had fed hundreds of high-resolution images of my face into an advanced artificial intelligence program. They had likely pulled the images from Hawthorne family event photos, charity gala coverages, and social media. They had mapped my expressions, my bone structure, and my exact physical dimensions onto the body of an actress or a digital rendering. The realization of what they had done made the blood rush in my ears. This was not a spontaneous accusation born out of a sudden misunderstanding or a simple dislike for my presence in their family. This level of digital forgery required highly specialized software, immense financial resources, and most importantly, time. They had been planning this execution for months. While I had been sitting at their Thanksgiving table enduring Beatrice and her snide remarks about my upbringing, they had been secretly hiring black market tech experts to digitally construct my absolute ruin. "You engineered this," I said. The words fell into the quiet room like heavy stones. Harrison let out a patronizing sigh. Denial is a predictable first response for a cornered criminal. But I assure you, Savannah, the federal authorities will not be swayed by your desperate lies. This evidence is already being compiled into a comprehensive dossier. It is a deepfake, I stated. My voice gained strength and clarity in the heavy silence. I raised my hand and pointed directly at the screen. The shadow mapping on the facial rendering contradicts the ambient light source in the background. The resolution degradation around the briefcase is a classic artifact of AI-generated image splicing. You paid a shadow firm to fabricate these photos. For a fraction of a second, I saw Harrison's eyes widen. A microscopic twitch in his jaw betrayed his surprise. He had not expected me to understand the technical flaws in his multi-million-dollar forgery. He had expected me to cry, to desperately proclaim my innocence while crumbling under the weight of his absolute authority. He had severely underestimated his target. Beatrice quickly stepped in to fill the momentary silence. Her voice dripped with pure venom. "Listen to her, Harrison. She is throwing out technical jargon to confuse the issue. It is exactly what a corporate spy would do." She turned her freezing glare toward Liam. "This is what happens when you bring a stray dog into a palace, Liam. They do not know how to be loyal. They only know how to scavenge and steal. We warned you that her foster care background made her a massive liability. People who grow up with absolutely nothing will do anything to get their hands on our wealth." The cruelty of her words was a physical blow. It was a deliberate attempt to weaponize my deepest childhood traumas against me. She wanted to paint me as a damaged, greedy opportunist who had finally shown her true colors. They were building a narrative so airtight, so deeply rooted in class prejudice and manufactured evidence that no one in their elite social circle would ever question it. "You have been building this trap for months," I said, looking back and forth between the two billionaires who stood behind the mahogany desk. "You knew you could not just convince Liam to leave me. He loves me too much, and your standard emotional manipulation was not working. So you decided to frame me for a federal crime. You want to make me so radioactive, so dangerous to his career, that he has no choice but to cut me loose. We are protecting our son from a predator, Beatrice spat, dropping all pretense of maternal concern. Her face was flushed with ugly, triumphant malice. We are protecting the Hawthorne legacy. You thought you had secured your place in this family savannah. You thought you could just quietly exist in our world and reap the benefits of our name. But we have outsmarted you. These photos, these transaction logs, they are flawless enough to trigger a formal federal investigation. The moment we hand this dossier over to the authorities, your life, as you know, it is entirely over. Harrison leaned heavily against the desk, resting his knuckles on the polished wood. The FBI will freeze your personal accounts. They will seize your passport. You will be dragged out of your home in handcuffs, and you will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for corporate espionage and international fraud. And because of your charmingly tragic background, no judge in this country will grant you bail. I felt Liam step even closer to my side. The heat radiating from his body was the only thing keeping the chill of the room from freezing me completely. He knew they were lying. He knew I was innocent. But he also knew the terrifying power of the Hawthorne machine. With their billions of dollars and their deep-seated political connections, they could easily push this fabricated evidence through the legal system. They had the resources to bury the truth under a mountain of expensive litigation and purchase testimonies. They had cornered us perfectly. If Liam tried to use his CIA connections to clear my name, he would blow his cover and ruin his own career in the process. If he did not intervene, I would be destroyed by a fake narrative designed by his own parents. They had meticulously calculated every possible variable to ensure our absolute defeat. The suffocating silence in the study stretched out for a long and agonizing moment. The glowing projection screen bathed the room in a harsh artificial light. Harrison and Beatrice stood behind the massive mahogany desk like conquering generals surveying a conquered territory. I could feel the cold reality of their trap pressing down on my chest. We were trapped in their game. Beatrice was the first to break the heavy stillness. She moved with a slow and predatory grace toward the center of the desk. Her sapphire gown caught the dim light as she reached down and opened the top drawer. She withdrew a thick manila folder and dropped it onto the polished wood surface. The heavy slap of the paper against the desk sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. She rested her manicured hands flat against the folder and looked directly at my husband. "We are not unreasonable people," Beatrice said. Her voice was remarkably calm and soothing. It was the exact tone a parent might use to comfort a child who had made a foolish mistake. "We are simply giving you the opportunity to correct that mistake before it destroys your entire life." She slid the folder across the smooth surface of the desk. It came to a stop just a few inches from where Liam and I were standing. "Open it," she instructed gently. Liam did not reach for the folder. He kept his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. His dark eyes remained fixed on his mother with an expression of pure and unadulterated disgust. "I do not need to open it to know what kind of poison you are offering," he replied. His voice was dangerously soft. Harrison let out a heavy sigh and stepped forward. He reached out and flipped the folder open himself. Inside was a thick stack of legal documents printed on expensive heavy stock paper. I could clearly see the bold capitalized letters at the top of the first page. It was a petition for the dissolution of marriage. They were divorce papers. They had been completely filled out and prepared in advance. They were only missing Liam and his signature. "This is your way out," Harrison explained. He tapped his finger against the signature line at the bottom of the page. "You sign these papers right now. You dissolve this disastrous marriage and you wash your hands of this woman completely. If you do that, we will handle the rest. We will hand the evidence over to the federal authorities, and we will make sure they know you had absolutely no involvement in her corporate espionage. You will walk away with a clean record and your reputation entirely intact." Beatrice stepped closer to her husband, and more importantly, she added, her eyes gleaming with a calculating light. "Your $50 million trust fund will remain completely untouched. All you have to do is sever the dead weight." I stared at the divorce papers resting on the desk. The sheer magnitude of their cruelty was breathtaking. They were not just trying to send me to federal prison. They wanted to force Liam to be the one who pulled the trigger. They wanted to strip away his loyalty and force him to choose between his vast generational wealth and the woman he loved. They were testing the absolute limits of his devotion. "You are asking me to throw my wife to the wolves to save my own skin," Liam said. The tension radiating from his body was palpable. "You are asking me to sign away my marriage to protect a trust fund." "We are asking you to be smart," Harrison corrected sharply. His tone lost its paternal warmth and hardened into cold authority. "Look at the evidence on that screen, Liam. It is flawless. We have spent an exorbitant amount of money ensuring that those deepfake photos will hold up under intense federal scrutiny. The moment we release that dossier, Savannah will be arrested. The media will devour the story of the greedy orphan who tried to steal from the Hawthorne Empire. If you try to stand by her, you will go down with the ship." Liam took a slow and deliberate step forward. He placed himself squarely between me and his parents. "I am not signing anything," he stated. His voice carried the unyielding weight of an absolute promise. "And you are not going to release those photos. You are going to unlock the front gates, and you are going to let us walk out of this house." A loud and mocking laugh erupted from the doorway. Preston had been standing quietly near the armed guards, but he could no longer contain his amusement. "You really are a romantic idiot," Preston sneered. He stopped a few feet away from us, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his expensive tuxedo pants. "You are actually considering throwing away your entire future for a nobody from a group home. It is pathetic. She has no family. She has no connections. She has absolutely no value to offer you or the Hawthorne name. She is a street rat who got lucky for a few years. And now her luck has completely run out." I kept my expression entirely neutral. I refused to let Preston see how deeply his insults cut into me. I had spent my entire life building my self-worth from the ground up. I was not going to let an arrogant billionaire tear it down with a few cruel words. I stood tall beside my husband, maintaining my silent and dignified composure. But Preston only smiled wider. His arrogance blinded him to the very real danger radiating from Liam. "I am just trying to introduce some basic logic into your hero complex," Preston continued. He gestured toward the divorce papers on the desk. "You have a very promising career ahead of you. We all know you do some sort of high-level security consulting for the government. You have federal clearances. You have a spotless professional record. Do you honestly think your agency will keep you on the payroll when your wife is indicted for international corporate espionage?" Preston leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "They will fire you. You will lose every single advantage you have ever had in this life. And for what? For a woman who grew up in the foster system. A woman who will spend the next 20 years rotting in a federal cell anyway." The reality of Preston's words hung heavy in the air. He was laying out the exact parameters of their trap. They knew that a criminal indictment against a spouse would immediately trigger a massive security review for any federal employee. They knew they held the power to destroy Liam and his professional life, just as thoroughly as they planned to destroy my freedom. I looked up at my husband. The muscles in his jaw were clenched tight. His dark eyes were fixed on the divorce papers resting on the smooth mahogany wood. The pressure bearing down on him was astronomical. His entire family was standing united against him. They were offering him a golden parachute, a guaranteed way out of the wreckage they had deliberately caused. All he had to do was abandon me. The heavy oak doors remained firmly locked, sealing us inside this nightmare. Harrison crossed his arms over his chest and stared at Liam with a cold and expectant gaze. "The clock is ticking," Harrison said. His voice was stripped of any remaining patience. "You have 2 minutes to pick up that pen and sign those papers. If you refuse, I will make the phone call to the federal authorities myself. Make your choice." The silence in the study became absolute. Every eye in the room was locked on Liam. The Hawthorne family waited with breathless anticipation, fully expecting him to break under the crushing weight of their immense power. The heavy silence was shattered by the sharp click of the study door unlocking. The heavy oak swung inward on its silent hinges, and the armed guards stepped apart to allow a new figure to enter. It was Camilla. She stepped over the threshold, closing the door firmly behind her. The metallic thud of the locks re-engaging echoed through the space. She smoothed the skirt of her silver gown and walked toward us with casual elegance. Her blonde hair remained perfectly styled, and the cold, predatory smile from the ballroom was now fully unleashed. She glided across the thick carpet, coming to a halt beside her mother. Beatrice placed an approving hand on her shoulder. Camilla looked at the divorce papers resting on the desk, then shifted her gaze to Liam. Her smile widened. "You look incredibly tense, big brother," Camilla observed. Her voice was light and airy, a jarring contrast to the heavy hostility suffocating the room. "I thought you would have signed those papers by now. It is really the most logical choice. Father is offering you a perfectly clean exit." Liam did not take the bait. He kept his body perfectly still, acting as a physical shield between me and his family. "You should not be in here," Camilla, Liam warned. His voice was low and gravelly, carrying a lethal warning that would have terrified a normal person. "You need to step outside and let Father and me finish this conversation." Camilla let out a delicate laugh. She leaned against the edge of the mahogany desk, crossing her arms over her chest. "Oh, Liam, you always try so hard to play the protective hero. It is honestly quite exhausting to watch. I am not going anywhere. In fact, I am the reason we are all standing in this room having this lovely family intervention." She turned her icy blue eyes toward me. The look she gave me was pure, unadulterated triumph. I stared back at her, maintaining my neutral expression, but my mind was racing. I remembered the pale champagne bubbling in the crystal flute she had handed me just a half hour ago. I remembered the swift, urgent way Liam had snatched it away from my lips. "I see you are putting the pieces together," Savannah, Camilla said. She noticed the slight shift in my posture and pounced on it immediately. "You were always a very observant little accountant. Tell me, did you actually think I was offering you a genuine olive branch down there in the ballroom? Did you think 5 years of mutual hatred could be washed away with a single glass of vintage champagne? You are far too smart for that." I kept my voice incredibly steady as I responded. "I knew the drink was tampered with, Camilla. Liam saw the residue before I could take a sip. What I want to know is why you thought a simple poison would solve your problems. A dead body in the middle of a high society gala would destroy the Hawthorne reputation faster than any corporate espionage scandal." Camilla rolled her eyes, looking genuinely offended by my accusation. "Poison. Please, Savannah, give us some credit. We are not common street thugs. We are not interested in creating a messy murder investigation. That would be completely counterproductive." Harrison stepped forward. "Tell them what was in the glass, Camilla. Let them understand exactly how thoroughly we prepared for tonight." Camilla smiled brightly. "It was not a lethal poison, Savannah. It was a highly synthesized military-grade hallucinogen. A neurotoxin designed to directly attack the central nervous system and induce a state of acute, irreversible psychosis." The sheer cruelty of her words sent a violent shiver down my spine. I looked at Liam. His face was a mask of cold fury, but I could see the sudden realization dawning in his dark eyes. He understood the tactical brilliance of their twisted plan. Beatrice stepped forward. "We did not want to kill you, Savannah," she explained, her tone dripping with false pity. "We wanted everyone to see exactly how unstable and unhinged you truly are." Camilla nodded enthusiastically. "The plan was wonderfully simple. You would drink the champagne. The hallucinogen is completely tasteless and odorless. Within 10 minutes, the chemical would cross the blood-brain barrier. You would begin to experience severe auditory and visual hallucinations. You would lose all touch with reality. You would become paranoid, violent, and completely out of control." I felt my stomach churn as I pictured the terrifying scenario they had orchestrated. They wanted me to have a catastrophic mental breakdown in the middle of their grand summer gala. They wanted me to lose my mind in front of hundreds of influential politicians, wealthy investors, and elite socialites. Harrison leaned over the desk. "Can you imagine the spectacle?" he asked, his voice low and cruel. "The charity case wife of the Hawthorne heir screaming and tearing her clothes off in the middle of a ballroom. It would have been tragic, of course. We would have played the part of the deeply concerned family. We would have called the paramedics ourselves. We would have told the press that the pressures of our world had simply broken your fragile mind." The true depth of their malice was suffocating. They were trying to permanently commit me to a psychiatric facility. But their plan went deeper than simply removing me from the family picture. It was specifically designed to force Liam to abandon me. Preston finally chimed in. You see, Liam, we know more about your career than you think we do, Preston said. We know you are not just pushing papers. We know you hold high-level security clearances. We know your agency requires absolute stability from its operatives and their immediate families. Liam stood rigid. His silence was a confirmation. Camilla clapped her hands together lightly. Exactly, she chirped. If your wife suffers a violent psychotic break, she becomes an immediate national security threat. Your agency would never allow you to remain married to a woman who could compromise sensitive intelligence during a hallucination. You would be called into a massive security review. They would force you to choose between your badge and your unstable wife. And we all know how much you value your career. You would have no choice but to sign those divorce papers and commit her to a hospital. You would be the dutiful husband doing what had to be done. The Hawthorne name would be protected from the fallout. I stared at the four billionaires standing united against us. They had meticulously calculated every variable. They had found the exact pressure point needed to break Liam's loyalty. They knew he would fight to protect me from a physical threat, but he could not protect his covert career from a spouse who had been deemed medically insane. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Beatrice let out a frustrated sigh. It truly was a flawless strategy, she complained. It would have been clean, efficient, and unquestionable. But you just had to intervene, Liam. You had to snatch that glass away. You ruined months of careful preparation. Harrison picked up the silver laser pointer again. The red dot danced across the deepfake photos still projected on the screen. Because you interrupted Camilla in the ballroom, we were forced to pivot, Harrison stated. We had to discard the primary objective and move directly to our contingency strategy, the corporate espionage narrative. It is admittedly much messier than locking Savannah in a padded room. It requires far more legal maneuvering and financial payoff. But the end result is exactly the same. The choice remains in your hands, Liam. The trap is slightly different, but the jaws are just as sharp. You sign the divorce papers right now, or we release this digital dossier to the federal authorities and watch her burn. Harrison stepped around the edge of the massive mahogany desk, closing the physical distance between us. He moved with the terrifying confidence of a man who had never once been told no in his entire life, a billionaire who believed that every law, every rule, and every human life was simply a commodity to be bought and sold. The threat of a standard federal indictment was apparently not enough to satisfy his need for absolute overwhelming dominance. He wanted to ensure that Liam understood the true terrifying scope of the Hawthorne family and their unrestricted reach. Do not think for a single second that this will be a fair and balanced legal process. Harrison continued, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register that seemed to vibrate against the soundproofed walls. You know exactly who I play golf with on the weekends, Liam. You know the names of the generals, the intelligence directors, and the defense contractors who sit at my dining table. If you force my hand tonight, I will not just drop this digital dossier off at a local field office. I will make a direct encrypted phone call to the highest levels of the Pentagon. I felt a cold, sharp chill wash over my skin as the sheer magnitude of his threat hung heavily in the dead air. Harrison raised his hand, pointing a single accusatory finger directly at my chest. I will bypass the standard justice system entirely, Harrison stated, his eyes locking onto mine with ruthless, unyielding intent. I will have my contacts in the Department of Defense classify Savannah, not just as a common corporate thief, but as an active, embedded undercover operative working for a hostile foreign intelligence network. I will attach her name to the most severe domestic terrorism watch lists in the country. I will make her a matter of urgent national security. The cruelty of his plan was staggering. He was openly threatening to weaponize the entire United States military and intelligence apparatus simply to settle a family dispute and protect his own corrupt legacy. Do you know what happens to unauthorized foreign spies who steal from defense-adjacent financial institutions? Liam Harrison asked, turning his gaze back to his son. They do not get a highly publicized trial in a downtown courthouse. They do not get a jury of their peers. They do not get to call a lawyer. They are quietly apprehended under the cover of absolute darkness. They are thrown into the back of an unmarked van, stripped of their identity, and they disappear into a classified black site. She will be entirely erased from existence. Beatrice stepped up beside her husband, her face glowing with a sickeningly triumphant smile. Her sapphire gown rustled softly against the thick, expensive carpet as she moved. "Your father is not exaggerating, Liam," Beatrice added softly. Her tone was dripping with that same fake maternal sympathy she used to manipulate her elite social circle. "You know how the federal machine works better than anyone in this room. If Savannah is designated as an enemy combatant, she will be stripped of every single legal right she currently possesses. She will spend the rest of her natural life in a windowless concrete cell, enduring intensive interrogations that will make her wish she had simply drank Camilla and her poisoned champagne." Camilla let out a soft, highly amused giggle from her place, leaning against the heavy wooden desk. "It really is a terrible shame," Camilla mused, swirling an imaginary glass in her manicured hand. She could have just lost her mind for a few hours. It would have been so much easier and far less painful for everyone involved. But now she gets to be a ghost, a forgotten casualty of playing games with people who are vastly superior to her. I kept my posture completely rigid and my expression perfectly neutral, refusing to give any of them the satisfaction of seeing me tremble. Inside, my mind was racing at lightning speed, analyzing every single word they spoke. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so insulated by their extreme wealth, that they were freely and loudly admitting to a conspiracy to commit treason, federal fraud, and kidnapping. They felt completely invincible behind the locked doors of their heavily guarded estate, believing their money made them untouchable deities. Preston clapped his hands together, the sharp, sudden sound startling in the tense and suffocating atmosphere. So little brother Preston sneered, stepping closer to join his parents in their victorious lineup. "The choice is beautifully simple and incredibly straightforward. You can pick up that pen sign, the thick, heavy stack of divorce papers right now, walk away with your $50 million trust fund, and keep your shiny, important covert career entirely intact. Or you can play the tragic romantic hero, refuse to sign the paperwork, and watch the United States government drag your beloved wife into a dark hole where she will never see the sun again. What is it going to be?" Every eye in the quiet room shifted back to Liam. The pressure bearing down on him was astronomical. It was a crushing physical weight specifically designed to break his spirit, obliterate his loyalty, and force his absolute submission. I turned my head slightly to look at my husband, the man who had stood as my impenetrable shield against this highly toxic family for the past 5 years. Liam was standing perfectly still. The fierce protective energy that usually radiated from him in waves had seemingly vanished, replaced by a tense, vibrating, and terrifying stillness. His broad shoulders, which were usually squared and brimming with unshakable confidence, dropped a tiny fraction of an inch. His large hands, which had been hovering near his sides, ready to strike down anyone who approached me, were now balled into tight, white-knuckled fists. The knuckles strained against his skin, trembling slightly, with the sheer, overwhelming force of his suppressed emotions. He looked down at the dark mahogany desk, his dark eyes fixing intensely on the divorce papers resting on the polished wood. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and noticeably uneven in the quiet room. The strong muscles in his jaw flexed and twitched rhythmically as he ground his teeth together. To the untrained eye, he looked exactly like a man who was being slowly and methodically torn apart from the inside out. He looked like a man who had finally realized he was entirely outmatched by an unstoppable force. The silence in the soundproofed study grew incredibly heavy and oppressive. The only sound in the entire room was the low mechanical hum of the ceiling projector, casting my fabricated deep-faked image against the far wall. Liam slowly raised his head. He did not look at his father or his mother or his sneering older brother. He looked directly at me. His dark eyes were swimming with an intense emotion that looked agonizingly close to total defeat. It was a look of profound, tortured hesitation that seemed to strip away all his formidable defenses. His expression conveyed the heartbreaking realization that he could not possibly save me without destroying us both in the process. He let out a ragged, shuddering breath, his broad chest heaving, as if the oxygen in the room had suddenly become far too thin to support him. He closed his eyes for a brief, agonizing second, painting the perfect picture of a man crumbling under the absolute dictatorial authority of the Hawthorne Empire. A collective, almost tangible wave of relief and vicious satisfaction washed over the opposing side of the room. The suffocating tension finally broke, instantly replaced by a sickening atmosphere of impending victory. The villains had seen exactly what they desperately wanted to see. They had seen the precise glorious moment the golden air finally broke under their pressure. Harrison let out a deep rumbling chuckle that vibrated with raw arrogance. He reached across the wide expanse of the desk, picking up an expensive, heavy gold-plated fountain pen. He held it out toward his son, his face glowing with a twisted, sickening sense of paternal triumph. "I knew you would ultimately see reason," Harrison said, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "You have always been a highly intelligent boy, Liam. You know deep down that blood is the only thing that truly matters in this harsh, unforgiving world. Everything else, including this temporary infatuation, is just meaningless noise." Beatrice brought a perfectly manicured hand to her chest, letting out a highly dramatic theatrical sigh of relief. "Oh, thank goodness." Beatrice breathed a triumphant and icy smile stretching widely across her perfectly structured face. "We can finally put this incredibly ugly and embarrassing chapter completely behind us. I will personally have the cleaning staff clear out all of her cheap belongings from your city penthouse first thing in the morning. We can start completely fresh. We will find you someone far more suitable, someone with the proper pedigree and impeccable breeding." Camilla practically bounced on her expensive heels, her bright blue eyes shining with unchecked malicious glee. "I officially call dibs on her jewelry collection," Camilla chirped happily, clapping her hands together. "Not that any of it is particularly valuable or tasteful, of course, but it is entirely the principle of the thing. Consider it a small parting gift for all the trouble and embarrassment she has continually caused us over the years." Preston crossed his muscular arms over his chest, leaning back with an air of absolute, unquestionable superiority. He looked at me, his upper lip curling into a sharp sneer of pure, unfiltered disgust. "Take a very good look around, Savannah," Preston mocked, gesturing widely to the luxurious book-lined study. "This is the absolute last time you will ever see the inside of a room like this. From here on out, your entire world is going to be very small, very dark, and incredibly lonely. You should have just stayed in the foster system where you belonged." The Hawthorne family openly reveled in their perceived and absolute victory. They were deeply intoxicated by their own immense power, completely and utterly convinced that their billions of dollars and ruthless illegal tactics had successfully crushed the only threat to their absolute control. They believed they had effectively severed the deep, unbreakable bond between Liam and me, reducing our entire 5-year marriage to a discarded piece of paper resting on a mahogany desk. They thought they had undeniably won. They thought the game was entirely over. They had absolutely no idea that the entire devastating game had not even begun. Liam let out a slow, jagged breath that seemed to echo loudly in the cavernous study. He lowered his head, his dark hair falling forward to obscure his eyes for a fleeting second. To his parents and his siblings, it was the ultimate picture of submission. It was the exact moment the wild, rebellious son finally bowed to the heavy crown of the Hawthorne legacy. Beatrice actually took a small step forward, her manicured hand reaching out as if to comfort the son she had just psychologically tortured. But I knew my husband better than anyone in that room. When he raised his head and locked his intense gaze with mine, there was no defeat in his dark eyes. There was only a silent, burning question. He was asking me for permission to unleash the storm we had been quietly building for the past 5 years. I gave him a fraction of a nod. It was a microscopic tilt of my chin that went entirely unnoticed by the 4 billionaires gloating across the mahogany desk. Liam took his hands off the edge of the desk. He did not reach for the expensive gold fountain pen. He did not reach for the thick stack of divorce papers. Instead, he took a deliberate step backward, creating a physical distance between himself and his toxic family. He crossed his arms over his broad chest and turned his body, slightly angling himself to stand firmly at my side. "I am not signing anything," Liam said. His voice was no longer a harsh whisper of contained fury. It was completely calm, completely detached, and terrifyingly serene. And you are not going to make a single phone call to the Pentagon, Father. Harrison frowned, his thick eyebrows drawing together in a display of genuine confusion. The triumphant sneer on his face faltered, quickly replaced by a dark brewing anger. What are you talking about? Liam Harrison demanded, his voice rising in volume. I just showed you absolute proof of her treason. I just offered you the only viable exit strategy you have left. Pick up that pen right now, or I swear to you I will destroy both of you. He is not going to pick up the pen, Harrison, I said. My voice cut through the heavy, oppressive air of the study like a silver blade. It was not the quiet, deferential tone I had used at countless family dinners. It was not the polite, carefully measured voice of the grateful orphan they thought I was. It was a voice forged in high-stakes federal courtrooms and secure briefing facilities. It was the voice of a woman who held the absolute power to dismantle empires. Beatrice let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. You do not get to speak in this room, Savannah, Beatrice snapped, pointing a trembling finger at me. You have absolutely no authority here. You are a cornered rat and your time is entirely up. I ignored her completely. I did not grant Beatrice the dignity of a glance. Instead, I let a smile form on my face. It was not the polite smile I had worn through 5 years of insults, charity dinners, and staged family photographs. It was not the nervous smile of the foster child they still imagined whenever they looked at me. It was the calm smile of someone who had finally reached the moment she had been preparing for. That smile unsettled them more than anger would have. Harrison stopped extending the gold fountain pen toward Liam. His eyes moved from my face to my hands, suspicious. Preston straightened near the door. Camilla's expression tightened. Even Beatrice seemed to sense that the balance in the room had shifted in a way she could not understand. I reached behind my neck. For the first time that evening, Harrison looked confused instead of triumphant. His gaze followed my fingers as I found the clasp of the narrow metal necklace I had worn beneath the neckline of my dress. Beatrice had mocked it months earlier, calling it cheap. None of them had ever asked why I wore the same plain piece of metal to almost every Hawthorne gathering. I released the clasp and slowly drew the necklace free. A slim, dark pendant rested against my palm. It was no larger than the tip of my thumb, flat and almost featureless, with no gemstone and no decorative engraving. To anyone else it would have looked worthless. To the people across the desk it should have looked familiar. It had been inside their home and private offices for years. Camilla gave a contemptuous laugh, but it came out too quickly. What is that supposed to be? She asked. Another piece of discount jewelry. No, I said. It is the reason I never needed your jewelry. I pressed my thumbnail against one edge of the pendant. A nearly invisible seam opened. The decorative shell separated from a tiny internal module, no larger than a fingernail. A faint indicator light blinked once, then disappeared. Preston's smile vanished. Harrison's eyes narrowed. What is that? I turned the device between my fingers so the metal caught the projector light. A storage module, I replied. Small enough to be ignored. Quiet enough to sit in a room full of people who believe the person wearing it is beneath their notice. Beatrice scoffed, but there was fear beneath the sound now. You expect us to be frightened by a memory card. I looked at her at last. You should be frightened by what people reveal when they are convinced the person beside them does not matter. The room went still. For 5 years they had spoken around me as if I were furniture. Harrison had taken calls on terraces because he assumed I did not understand offshore entities. Preston had complained about regulators while I sat 3 chairs away. Beatrice had left sophisticated to recognize account structures. Their contempt had created access that force could never have purchased. I closed my fingers around the tiny device. You spent years trying to make me feel invisible, I said. Eventually I realized invisibility could be useful. Harrison's face hardened. He attempted to recover the authority that had carried him through boardrooms and political fundraisers. Whatever you think you heard in this house means nothing, he said. Private conversations are not evidence. You are still a disgruntled accountant with fabricated accusations and no standing. I tilted my head slightly. Is that what you think this contains? His silence answered for him. The pendant was not the entire case. I did not need to explain every technical function to them. What mattered was that they understood the harmless ornament they had ignored had never been harmless. It had carried encrypted snapshots, authentication fragments, transaction signatures, and access records gathered during carefully timed windows inside their network. Every small piece was useless by itself. Placed beside the financial patterns I had been studying, those fragments became a map. Preston moved away from the door and took one cautious step toward me. Liam shifted instantly. He did not raise his hands. One small change in his stance was enough to stop Preston where he stood. "Do not," Liam said. Preston froze. I continued as if nothing had happened. "You built your entire defense around one assumption, Harrison. You assumed the woman your family humiliated at dinner could never understand what she was seeing. You assumed I was too grateful to question anything. Most of all, you assumed your money made your systems smarter than the people examining them." Harrison's jaw tightened. I lifted the tiny module between us. "Months ago, I found a pattern that should not have existed. Funds moved through legitimate domestic accounts disappeared behind layered entities, then reappeared overseas after passing through a private routing architecture. Every trail broke at the same point. Whoever designed that barrier knew exactly how investigators would search and where they would expect the trail to end." For the first time, Harrison looked genuinely alarmed. Beatrice noticed it. She turned toward him. "Harrison." I ignored her. I watched his face. That microscopic change was all the confirmation I needed. The Cayman structure mattered to him more than the deep-fake photographs, the divorce papers, or the $50 million trust fund he had waved in front of his son. It was the hidden spine of the machine. Camilla looked between us, confused. "What is she talking about?" No one answered her. I took another slow step toward the desk. The pendant lay open in my palm, its tiny internal module exposed beneath the projector light. "You were careful with the companies in Cyprus," I said. "You were careful with the false consulting agreements. You were careful with the pension transfers and foreign intermediaries. But the real protection was never the paperwork. It was the digital wall around the Cayman routing system." Harrison's face turned pale. Preston whispered, "Father, what did she find?" Still Harrison said nothing. The silence was more powerful than any confession. I remembered every dinner when they had laughed at my education, every holiday when Beatrice had reminded me I had no parents, every moment Camilla had treated me as if I were lucky to breathe the same expensive air. All that cruelty had been intended to shrink me. Instead, it had taught them to stop watching me. I smiled again. "You wanted Liam to believe I was a traitor," I said. "You built fake photographs, fake transfers, fake signatures, and a complete fictional life for me. But while you were manufacturing a crime, I never committed. I was studying crimes that were very real." Harrison finally found his voice. "Give me that device." It was the first honest order he had given all night. There was no theatrical disappointment in it, no concern for Liam, no talk of protecting the family name. There was only fear. I curled my fingers around the pendant. "No." His hand flattened against the desk. "Savannah, you have no idea what you are interfering with." That was when I knew he still had not understood. I looked directly into his eyes and asked the question I had waited months to ask. "Do you know who built the firewall protecting your money laundering system in the Cayman Islands, Harrison?" Every person in the room stopped moving. Beatrice stared at her husband. Preston's mouth fell open. Camilla's face lost the last traces of color. Harrison did not answer. He did not need to. The terror in his expression said more than words could. I slipped the opened pendant into my palm and drew back the sleeve of my dress, exposing the sleek, matte black smartwatch strapped to my left wrist. The necklace had shown them that I had been collecting pieces of their secrets. The watch was about to show them what those pieces could do. "You spent a truly astronomical amount of money fabricating those deepfake photographs," I stated, gesturing casually toward the glowing projection screen on the wall behind them. "You hired black market developers. You utilized advanced artificial intelligence. You created a very compelling visual narrative to frame me for corporate espionage. But you made one massive fundamental miscalculation in your grand strategy. Preston scoffed loudly from his position near the armed guards. "Oh, please enlighten us," Preston mocked, rolling his eyes dramatically. What could a mid-level paper-pushing accountant possibly know about grand strategy? I tapped the face of my smartwatch. The dark screen flared to life, illuminating the digital keypad. I did not look down as my fingers moved with rapid practice precision. I typed in a complex 24-character encrypted command sequence that I had memorized months ago. "I know that you should never, under any circumstances, connect your highly sensitive illegal projection equipment to a local network that I already have backdoor access to," I replied softly. I hit the enter key on my watch. The reaction in the room was instantaneous and violently disruptive. The high-definition projector mounted in the ceiling let out a loud, high-pitched electronic whine. The massive fabricated image of me handing a briefcase to a foreign spy abruptly froze. The colors on the screen inverted, turning neon green and bright purple before dissolving into a chaotic storm of digital static. "What are you doing?" Camilla shrieked, jumping back from the desk as the sudden harsh noise startled her. Harrison furiously jabbed the buttons on his silver remote control, but the device was completely unresponsive. The connection had been entirely severed. "Turn it off!" Harrison commanded, turning his angry glare toward the armed guards by the door. "Unplug the main server." "It is far too late for that, Harrison," I said, taking a confident step forward. The digital static on the massive wall screen suddenly cleared. The harsh, bright light was replaced by a stark, solid black background. A few seconds later, a large, highly detailed emblem faded into view in the center of the screen. It was the official, unmistakable seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically the Financial Crimes Division. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. Preston stumbled backward, his arrogant posture completely collapsing as he stared at the federal seal glowing against the mahogany wood of his father's private sanctuary. "You called me a mid-level accountant," I said, my voice ringing with absolute unshakable authority. "You thought I spent my days balancing spreadsheets for small businesses and fetching coffee for senior partners. You thought my background in the foster care system made me weak, desperate, and easy to manipulate. You thought I was just a tragic charity case who was lucky to be allowed at your dinner table." I took another step closer to the desk. Harrison was staring at the screen, his chest heaving as the reality of the situation began to crash down around him. "I am a senior forensic accountant," I declared, looking directly into Harrison's panicked eyes. "I am an independent, highly classified contractor, retained exclusively by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My specific operational mandate is to track, analyze, and dismantle international money laundering syndicates that operate under the guise of legitimate corporate entities." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute. It was the silence of a collapsing dynasty. I watched the arrogant, untouchable Hawthorne family realize that the monster they had been trying to destroy had actually been holding their leash the entire time. For the past 5 years, I continued letting every single word land with the devastating impact of a physical blow. "You have been treating me like an uneducated peasant. You have been mocking my clothes, my upbringing, and my lack of social standing. And for the past 5 years, I have been using your arrogant blindness as my perfect cover. Every time you invited me to Sunday dinner, every time you forced me to attend one of your charity galas, I was mapping the architecture of your internal network. I was planting digital tracing software into your secured servers while you were busy making fun of my shoes." Harrison gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning stark white. "You are lying," he whispered, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "You do not have the clearance. You do not have the capability. I have analyzed over 40,000 encrypted transactions that you routed through your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands." I replied, my voice hard and unforgiving. "I have tracked every single shell company you established in Cyprus to hide the money you embezzled from your own investors. I found the deliberate, deeply hidden loopholes in your corporate tax filings. I know exactly how you bribed foreign officials to secure your overseas real estate developments. I know where every single penny of your dirty money lives." I raised my hand and pointed a finger directly at the patriarch of the Hawthorne Empire. "You brought the very weapon designed to destroy you right through your own front door, Harrison. You invited the federal government to sleep in your guest rooms because you were too arrogant to believe a woman from a group home could ever outsmart you. The air in the study felt electric charged with the sudden violent shift in power. The Hawthorne family had spent the entire evening believing they were the predators toying with helpless prey. Now staring at the glowing federal seal on their wall and listening to me methodically list their most guarded treasonous secrets, they finally understood the truth. They had not trapped a vulnerable victim in their soundproofed study. They had locked themselves inside a cage with the very executioner who was holding the axe. They were completely stripped of their illusions. The immense, terrifying power they had wielded for generations was nothing compared to the absolute crushing reality of the federal justice system crashing down upon their heads. The suffocating atmosphere in the study shattered as I tapped my smartwatch. The massive projection screen shifted from the imposing seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation to a scrolling display of raw financial data. Rows of numbers cascaded down the bright white surface, moving with a dizzying speed that illuminated the horrified faces of the Hawthorne family. These were not the sanitized financial reports Harrison released to his shareholders. These were the true, unredacted accounting ledgers of the Hawthorne investment empire. I had spent countless nights decrypting these files, pulling them directly from the hidden servers they thought were secure. Harrison staggered forward, his hands gripping the edge of his mahogany desk. He stared at the cascading numbers, tracking the data with a look of absolute terror. He knew exactly what he was looking at. I was watching his carefully constructed illusion of supreme wealth being laid bare in undeniable detail. You have spent your entire lives projecting an image of untouchable financial supremacy, I said, slowly pacing across the thick carpet. You bought this $30 million estate. You wear sapphire gowns that cost more than a suburban home. You host lavish galas for politicians and pretend that you are the unbreakable pillars of the American economy. But it is all a massive, desperate lie. You are not billionaires. You are drowning in catastrophic debt, and your empire is standing on the absolute brink of total bankruptcy. Beatrice let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She shook her head violently, her perfectly styled silver hair trembling. That is completely absurd, she stammered, her voice stripped of all its previous aristocratic confidence. We have vast holdings. We have liquid assets. You are manipulating the data to make us look weak. I stopped pacing and locked my gaze with my mother-in-law. I am not manipulating anything, Beatrice. I am simply turning on the lights in the dark room where you hide your deepest failures. I tapped my watch again, bringing a specific spreadsheet to the forefront of the screen. The numbers on this document were highlighted in glaring red. Look at the exact amount of capital you currently hold in your legitimate domestic accounts. It is essentially nothing. You have leveraged every single asset you own to secure more loans to pay off previous loans. You have been operating a glorified Ponzi scheme, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of your wealth while the foundation rotted away beneath your feet. The true horror of their crimes went far beyond simple bankruptcy. I shifted my focus back to Harrison, who was sweating profusely under the harsh projector light. When you realized that the banks were finally going to stop lending you money, you did not downsize. I continued, my voice cold and unforgiving. You did not sell off your foreign properties or reduce your extravagant lifestyle. You decided to steal from the very people who trusted you most. You raided the corporate pension funds. Liam stepped closer to the desk, staring at the red numbers. He had known his family was corrupt, but the devastating scale of their theft was finally coming into clear focus. I pointed at a specific, heavily documented transaction log. Over this past 4 years, Harrison, you and your board have systematically embezzled more than $200 million directly from the retirement accounts of your own employees. You stole the life savings of thousands of hardworking people. You took the security of teachers and managers who invested their futures in your firm. You stripped them of their stability just so you could continue flying on private jets and hosting summer galas. The sheer magnitude of their callousness was sickening. They had deliberately ruined thousands of innocent lives to maintain their luxurious facade. Preston suddenly let out a loud, forced laugh. It was a desperate sound lacking any genuine humor. He stepped forward, trying to reclaim his shattered arrogance. You are bluffing. Preston sneered, though his hands were visibly shaking. You cannot prove any of this in a court of law. Numbers on a screen can easily be fabricated. You are just trying to scare us because you know we have you cornered. You have absolutely no hard evidence linking any of us directly to those specific transfers. I turned my attention to my arrogant brother-in-law. I smiled, letting him see the absolute certainty in my eyes. You always were the weakest link in this entire criminal enterprise, Preston, I stated calmly. Your father built this corrupt machine with calculated precision. But you are greedy, you are reckless, and you think that your family name makes you completely immune to consequence. I raised my wrist and tapped the screen of my smartwatch. I do not just have the encrypted digital ledgers, I announced, projecting my voice to ensure the armed guards heard every word. I also have the audio receipts. The financial data on the large screen faded away, replaced by a pulsating digital audio waveform. A second later, a voice filled the quiet study. It was crisp, clear, and unmistakably Preston. The audio had been captured during a highly secretive telephone call just 3 weeks ago. I do not care what the compliance officers are saying. Preston's recorded voice barked through the hidden speakers. You need to authorize the transfer from the holding account immediately. The auditors are getting too close to the Cayman routing numbers. Another voice answered on the recording. It was a nervous, hesitant bank official. Mr. Hawthorne, if I move that much capital without the proper oversight signatures, I am risking my entire career. The federal regulators are already monitoring our quarterly movements. Then I suggest you look at the secondary account I just opened in your wife's maiden name. Preston replied, his tone dripping with arrogant coercion. There is a $2 million deposit sitting in that account right now. It is completely untraceable. You process my transfer by midnight, and that $2 million is yours to keep. If you refuse, I will personally ensure that you never work in the financial sector again. I tapped my watch, stopping the audio playback. The quiet room felt like a graveyard. Preston stood completely paralyzed, his face drained of all color. He had just listened to his own voice committing a massive federal felony, offering a multi-million-dollar bribe to cover up their catastrophic debt. That recording has been authenticated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I informed him. We have the bank official in protective custody. He has provided a full confession detailing every time you bribed him to manipulate the internal ledgers. You left a glowing neon sign pointing directly to your own overwhelming guilt. Camilla pressed her hands against the sides of her head, her perfectly styled blonde hair falling into her panicked, tear-filled eyes. This cannot be happening to us, she whispered frantically, looking back and forth between her parents and her older brother. We are the Hawthorne family. We do not go to federal prison. We have the best lawyers and powerful politicians on our payroll. We can easily fix this. You have absolutely nothing. Camilla, I corrected her, my voice ringing with finality. The politicians you bought have distanced themselves from you. The elite lawyers you keep on retainer will not touch this case once they see the federal evidence I have compiled. Your entire empire is built on stolen money, bribery, and lies. Harrison gripped the mahogany desk, his breathing ragged. The commanding patriarch was gone, replaced by a desperate criminal who finally realized his immense wealth could no longer save him. He looked at the projection screen, then at the sealed doors, and finally at me. He had spent the evening trying to frame an innocent woman for his crimes, completely unaware he was sealing his own inevitable doom. The perfect, untouchable family was just a hollow shell, and I had just crushed it in my own hands. The reality of my words snapped the last thread of Camilla and her fragile sanity. She let out a piercing scream that ripped through the quiet study. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure panic. She lunged forward, her face contorted into a mask of absolute, unhinged desperation. Her eyes were fixed entirely on my left wrist at the matte black smartwatch that held the key to her destruction. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at me. "Smash it!" Camilla shrieked, her voice cracking under the intense strain of her own hysteria. "Get that watch off her right now and smash it into 1,000 pieces. Do not just stand there, you useless idiots, get it." The two armed mercenaries stationed by the heavy oak doors did not hesitate. They were highly paid private contractors who were accustomed to following the orders of the Hawthorne family without question. The moment Camilla screamed the command, the heavy, oppressive tension in the room instantly morphed into an immediate, lethal physical threat. The guard on the left lunged forward, his massive hands reaching out to grab my arm, while the guard on the right reached down to unholster his firearm, ready to enforce absolute compliance. I did not even have time to brace myself for the impact. Before I could take a single step backward, the air in front of me violently displaced. Liam moved with a speed and a terrifying precision that completely defied logic. For 5 years, his family had viewed him as a passive, agreeable consultant who sat in boring meetings and analyzed risk portfolios. They had never seen the man who was trained by the most elite intelligence agency on the planet to neutralize hostile threats in the blink of an eye. He did not step in front of me to simply shield my body. He exploded into action, a blur of calculated, devastating force. The first guard barely had time to register the movement before Liam struck. Liam grabbed the heavy wrist of the man reaching for me, twisting his arm with a sickening sharp torque that forced a loud shout of agonizing pain from the guard. In the exact same fluid motion, Liam drove his elbow directly into the man's throat, cutting off his air supply and dropping the 200-pound mercenary to the thick carpet in a heap of incapacitated dead weight. The second guard managed to draw his weapon, the dark metal of the handgun gleaming in the dim light of the study. But Liam was already turning. He stepped inside the guard's firing radius, entirely ignoring the barrel of the gun. He grabbed the weapon by the slide, forcefully redirecting the barrel toward the ceiling, while simultaneously sweeping the guard's legs out from under him. The man hit the mahogany desk hard, the expensive wood groaning under the violent impact. Liam twisted the gun out of his grip, stripped the magazine from the weapon with a sharp click, and tossed the useless pieces of metal across the room. He delivered a final precise strike to the side of the man's neck, sending him crashing to the floor right next to his partner. The entire violent altercation was over in less than 4 seconds. The two highly trained, heavily armed private security guards were completely incapacitated, groaning weakly on the expensive carpet. Liam stood perfectly balanced in front of me, his chest heaving slightly, his dark eyes scanning the room for any remaining physical threats. He did not even look at the two men groaning on the floor. He kept his gaze locked on his father and his older brother, silently daring them to make a single foolish move. His hands were loose and ready at his sides. The protective energy radiating from his body was an absolute impenetrable fortress. He had neutralized the danger with a ruthless efficiency that left his family staring at him in complete paralyzing horror. Harrison stumbled backward, his mouth hanging open in shock. Preston pressed himself flat against the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, his arrogant swagger entirely evaporated as he stared at the brother he had mocked just moments ago. They finally realized that the man they thought they controlled was actually a lethal, highly trained operative who could break them in half without breaking a sweat. With the immediate physical threat completely neutralized, the panic in the room instantly shifted back to the catastrophic financial ruin I had just exposed. Beatrice realized that violence was no longer an option. She realized that her son was not going to let anyone touch me, and she realized that her entire world was actively crumbling into dust. Beatrice let out a frantic, desperate gasp. She spun away from the center of the room and scrambled toward the edge of the large mahogany desk. Her hands were shaking violently as she grabbed her diamond-encrusted clutch purse. She ripped the clasp open, digging her manicured nails into the silk lining until she pulled out her personal, highly encrypted mobile phone. Her aristocratic composure was entirely shattered. She was no longer the terrifying matriarch of the Hawthorne dynasty. She was just a desperate, terrified woman trying to save her stolen fortune. "What are you doing?" Harrison demanded, his voice thick with panic as he watched his wife frantically jabbing her fingers against the glowing screen of her phone. "I am fixing this!" Beatrice snapped back, her eyes wide and wild. Her voice was trembling so badly she could barely form the words. "I am calling Martin at the Zurich bank. We need to initiate the emergency transfer protocols right this second. We need to move the remaining liquid capital into the blind trust in Geneva before the federal agents can secure the warrants to access those specific routing numbers. We can still salvage the overseas accounts if we move the money right now." She pressed the phone to her ear, her breathing shallow and erratic. She paced back and forth behind the desk, the heavy fabric of her sapphire gown rustling loudly in the quiet study. "Come on," she muttered to herself, tapping her foot anxiously against the carpet. "Pick up the phone, Martin. Pick up the phone right now. I stood safely behind my husband, watching the most powerful woman I had ever known, completely unravel in real time. For 5 years, I had endured her psychological torture. I had sat silently at her dinner table while she mocked my clothes, my upbringing, and my lack of social standing. I had swallowed my pride and maintained a polite smile while she actively tried to make me feel completely worthless. Now she was a frantic, terrified criminal grasping at the evaporating smoke of her stolen wealth. I stepped out from behind Liam. I did not need to hide anymore. I stood tall, my posture perfectly straight, my expression calm and utterly devoid of pity. I looked directly at my mother-in-law as she desperately held the phone to her ear, waiting for a corrupt banker to save her from the inevitable consequences of her own actions. "Do not bother, Beatrice," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried across the large study with the absolute crushing weight of a final judgment. Beatrice froze. She slowly lowered the phone from her ear, her icy blue eyes locking onto mine. The frantic desperation in her expression shifted into a look of deep, terrified confusion. I took a slow, measured step toward the center of the room. I kept my hands relaxed at my sides, projecting absolute control. "Martin is not going to answer your phone call, Beatrice," I informed her, letting the cold truth sink into the heavy air. "In fact, no one is going to answer any of your calls tonight. I used my system access to freeze all Hawthorne Global accounts 10 minutes ago. Every dollar you have stolen is totally gone." The silence following my declaration hung in the air like a physical weight. Harrison stared at me, his chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. The untouchable billionaire facade was gone, replaced by the panic of a man watching his empire burn. He looked at the projection screen, then down at his empty hands, and finally back at me. A dangerous, unpredictable energy began to radiate from him. The polished gentleman had vanished entirely. In his place stood a desperate, ruthless criminal who realized his money could no longer buy his salvation. The terrifying shift in his demeanor was violently abrupt. Harrison let out a sound that was half growl and half scream, a raw vocalization of pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged toward the massive mahogany desk, his heavy footsteps thudding against the thick carpet. He yanked open the heavy-bottomed drawer with such explosive force that the brass handle rattled loudly. My breath caught in my throat as he thrust his hand deep into the drawer. When he pulled his hand back out, the dim light of the study caught the cold gleam of polished metal. Harrison was holding a sleek black semi-automatic handgun. He raised the weapon with alarming speed and pointed the barrel directly at the center of my chest. The room erupted into absolute instantaneous chaos. Beatrice let out a piercing shriek and stumbled backward, pressing her hands over her mouth in sheer terror. Camilla covered her ears and backed into the bookshelves. Preston threw his hands up and backed away from his own father. The reality of the situation crashed over them. This had just escalated into a fatal confrontation. Liam reacted with the lightning-fast reflexes of a highly trained intelligence operative. The moment he saw the weapon clear the edge of the desk, he shifted his weight, preparing to launch himself across the room to disarm his father. He was ready to put his own body between the bullet and my chest. But I reached out and grabbed his arm, my fingers digging sharply into the dark fabric of his tuxedo jacket. I squeezed his forearm tightly, sending him a silent, urgent command to stand down. I knew the fragile, fractured psychology of a narcissistic billionaire pushed into a corner. If Liam rushed him now, Harrison would pull the trigger out of pure panicked instinct. I stood my ground, keeping my posture perfectly straight, and my gaze locked directly onto the barrel of the gun. My heart was hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to remain slow and measured. I refused to let him see me tremble. "You have completely lost your mind, Harrison," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, slicing through the panicked breathing and quiet sobbing of the women in the room. "Put the gun down before you make a mistake that you cannot buy your way out of." Harrison let out a harsh, manic laugh that bordered on total hysteria. His hand was shaking slightly, but his grip on the weapon remained firm. His eyes were wide and wild, stripped of all reason and logic. "I am not making a mistake." Savannah Harrison spat, his voice vibrating with absolute malice. "I am fixing a catastrophic error. I am excising the disease that infected my family the moment Liam brought you into our home. You think you have outsmarted the Hawthorne dynasty, but you are just a naive, arrogant little girl who played a game far above her station. I took a slow, menacing step around the edge of the desk, keeping the handgun aimed steadily at my heart. You honestly believe that I will just surrender? Harrison continued, his voice echoing in the soundproofed study. You think I will just let you walk out of this house and hand over my legacy to the federal government? I built this empire with my bare hands. I will not let a worthless foster child tear it down. I can shoot you right here. I can put a bullet in your chest, pry that electronic watch off your dead wrist and smash it into a million pieces. I can destroy the only physical link you have to your precious federal servers. The sheer delusion in his words was staggering. He was desperately clinging to the belief that violence could erase his financial crimes. And then what I challenged him, my tone dripping with cold, calculated logic. What is your grand escape plan after you murder your daughter-in-law in cold blood in front of 4 witnesses? Do you think Liam is just going to stand here and watch you kill his wife without snapping your neck in response? Do you think Beatrice and Camilla have the stomach to help you bury me in the Hamptons? Harrison sneered, waving his free hand dismissively. I will tell the police this was a robbery, he declared, his eyes burning with certainty. The cameras are already disabled, the gates were locked, and the house is in chaos. I will say, an armed intruder breached the estate, came upstairs looking for valuables, and you were caught in the middle. I can empty the safe, scatter jewelry across the floor, destroy your watch, and make the scene look convincing before anyone gets inside. My security people will confirm whatever version I give them. I have the best defense attorneys in the country and officials who owe me favors. By sunrise, you will be a tragic casualty of a break-in. I looked at the man holding the gun, feeling a profound sense of pity mixed with my disgust. I was completely oblivious to the fact that his extinction was already guaranteed. You really do not understand how modern forensic technology works, do you? Harrison, I asked softly. You are living in a fantasy world where a fat check and a good lawyer can magically erase digital reality. You think destroying my smartwatch will somehow stop the federal investigation. You think smashing a piece of hardware will delete the evidence. I took a fearless step forward, moving closer to the barrel of the gun. Liam tensed beside me, his protective instincts screaming at him to intervene, but he held his ground, trusting my psychological warfare. You are a financial dinosaur. Harrison. I continued, holding his panicked gaze. My watch is not a hard drive. It does not store the data locally. It is simply a secure access terminal. Every single encrypted ledger, offshore routing number, and recorded conversation proving your massive embezzlement has already been pushed to a secure, compartmentalized federal cloud server. I let the weight of that truth sink into the quiet space between us. The moment I tapped my screen and projected your stolen files onto that wall, an automated sequence was triggered. I explained, my voice echoing with absolute finality. The Federal Bureau of Investigation already has your complete financial history sitting on their desks in Washington. The agents assigned to your case are currently reviewing the exact coordinates of your hidden Cayman Island accounts. There is no way to recall the data. There is no password you can beat out of me to stop the process. The evidence is out of my hands, and it is entirely out of your reach. Harrison stared at me, his face turning an ashen gray. The hand holding the gun trembled as the crushing reality of my words dismantled his violent backup plan. If you pull that trigger, you will not be stopping a corporate espionage investigation, I said, delivering the final blow to his fractured psyche. You will simply be upgrading your federal indictment from white-collar financial fraud to premeditated murder. You will not be going to a resort prison for wealthy executives. You will be sent to a maximum security federal penitentiary. You will spend the rest of your miserable life locked in a concrete box, and your vast wealth will not buy you a single second of freedom. The absolute certainty in my voice finally pierced through the thick, delusional armor Harrison had worn his entire life. He stared at me, his hand shaking so violently that the heavy black handgun began to sway. He was a man who had built an empire by calculating risks and exploiting weaknesses, but he had never factored in the possibility of an adversary who was entirely immune to his wealth. He looked at the stark, unblinking federal seal, still glowing on the large projection screen behind him, and the terrifying reality of a maximum security prison cell finally began to settle over his fractured mind. He slowly lowered the weapon, the barrel pointing toward the thick carpet instead of my chest, but he did not drop it. Instead, a new, entirely unhinged kind of desperation washed over his face. Harrison let out a sharp, ragged breath and took a sudden step backward, putting the massive mahogany desk between us once again. He was not surrendering. He was simply shifting his tactics. If he could not shoot his way out of this nightmare, he was going to try to suffocate it. You think you are the only person in this room who understands how technology works? Savannah Harrison spat, his voice dropping into a low, menacing growl. You think I built a multi-billion-dollar international syndicate without understanding the absolute necessity of digital containment. He reached under the heavy wooden lip of his desk. His fingers fumbled blindly for a moment before finding a hidden, recessed control panel. He pressed his palm flat against a biometric scanner hidden from plain sight. A loud, heavy electronic hum immediately resonated through the floorboards of the study, vibrating up through the soles of my shoes. It was not the sound of a standard security system arming itself. It was the deep, industrial vibration of a military-grade signal jammer powering on from the basement of the estate. Almost instantly, the high-definition projector mounted in the ceiling let out a sharp sequence of beeping noises. The glowing seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation flickered violently on the wall, distorting into jagged, broken pixels before the screen went entirely black. The room was plunged back into the heavy, oppressive gloom, illuminated only by the dim brass lamps scattered across the bookshelves. I felt a sudden, distinct absence of the faint, high-pitched frequency that usually accompanied the estate and its massive wireless network. I glanced down at my left wrist. The interface on my matte black smartwatch flashed a bright yellow warning light, indicating that all local wireless and cellular connections had been completely severed. Harrison let out a loud, victorious bark of laughter. He slammed his free hand against the top of the desk, leaning forward with a terrifying, manic gleam in his eyes. Did you honestly believe I would leave my primary residence completely vulnerable to external surveillance? Harrison demanded, a twisted smile spreading across his pale face. The entire perimeter of this property is lined with specialized high-frequency jamming equipment. I just engaged a total electromagnetic blackout. There is not a single byte of data leaving this room. No cellular service, no wireless internet, no satellite communication. We are currently sitting inside a complete digital void. He gestured wildly toward my wrist, with the hand still gripping the firearm. You said your transfer triggered an automated sequence, Savannah. You said the data was already moving. But any forensic accountant knows that massive encrypted ledgers take significant time and uninterrupted bandwidth to fully upload to a remote federal server. I just severed your connection. You did not finish the transmission. The authorities might have a few fragmented files, but they do not have the complete architectural map of my accounts. They do not have the final undeniable proof they need to execute an arrest warrant tonight. The sudden chaotic shift in the technological landscape of the room acted like a shot of pure adrenaline for the rest of the Hawthorne family. The suffocating terror that had paralyzed them just moments ago began to rapidly evaporate. They clung desperately to Harrison and his arrogant assumption that he had successfully intercepted my data transfer. They eagerly embraced the illusion that they were back in absolute control of the narrative. Beatrice let out a long, shuddering breath, her hands dropping away from her face. She stood up perfectly straight, smoothing the heavy sapphire silk of her expensive gown with trembling but determined fingers. She rolled her shoulders back, lifting her chin to that familiar aristocratic angle she used to look down on the rest of the world. The terrified, cornered criminal vanished, instantly replaced by the haughty, untouchable matriarch of the Hawthorne dynasty. She stepped forward, positioning herself right next to her husband. She looked at me with a chilling, rejuvenated sense of pure malice. You really gave us quite a fright for a moment, Savannah, Beatrice said, her voice dripping with extreme condescending venom. I will admit you played your hand remarkably well for someone with such a pathetic, uneducated background. You almost managed to convince us that a lowly, insignificant accountant could actually dismantle generations of carefully cultivated power. But you clearly underestimated the resources we keep at our immediate disposal. Beatrice reached out and gently placed her hand over Harrison's, silently encouraging him to lower the weapon completely. "Violence is so terribly messy, Harrison," she murmured, keeping her icy blue eyes locked firmly on me. "We do not need to stain our carpets tonight. We simply need to clean up a rather unfortunate domestic dispute." She turned her gaze toward Liam, who was standing perfectly still beside me. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked ready to shatter. "You see, Liam? This is exactly how the elite operate." Beatrice lectured her tone, mirroring the harsh, dismissive lessons she used to give him when he was a child. "We do not panic when the lower classes attempt to stage a rebellion. We simply smother them. We bury them under the overwhelming, crushing weight of our superior resources." Savannah thought she could use her little federal contracts to threaten us, but she forgot one crucial, undeniable fact about this country. The justice system works entirely for the people who can afford to buy it. Camilla stepped out from the shadows of the bookshelves, a cruel, mocking smile returning to her perfectly painted lips. "So what is the grand plan now, Mother?" Camilla asked, her voice light and musical, as if they were discussing the menu for a charity luncheon rather than the cover-up of a massive federal felony. Beatrice smiled, a cold, empty expression that did not reach her eyes. "We are going to call the crisis management team," Beatrice announced with absolute terrifying certainty. "The underground cleaners we keep on retainer for highly sensitive situations exactly like this one. They operate entirely off the grid. They will be here within the hour. They will secure Savannah, transport her to a private, undisclosed medical facility, and chemically induce the psychotic break we originally planned for her. By the time the sun rises tomorrow morning, my darling daughter-in-law will be completely incapacitated, heavily sedated, and permanently committed under a false name." Preston barked a harsh, victorious laugh, stepping over the groaning bodies of the incapacitated security guards. "And what about the fragmented data she managed to upload before Father jammed the signal?" Preston asked, looking at me as if I were already a ghost. Beatrice waved her hand dismissively. "Fragmented data is useless in a federal court, Preston. Our lawyers will argue that it was maliciously manufactured by an unstable, disgruntled employee who was suffering from severe mental illness. We will bury the FBI under thousands of pages of expensive litigation until they drop the inquiry entirely. We will tie them up in so much bureaucratic red tape that they will forget the name Savannah even exists." Harrison leaned heavily against the mahogany desk, a smug, deeply satisfied grin returning to his face. "You played a very brave game." Savannah Harrison mocked, his voice echoing in the disconnected, isolated study. "You stood in my house and you threatened to take everything I own. But look around you. The doors are locked. The guards outside will not let anyone approach the second floor. The digital world is completely shut off. You are entirely alone, and nobody is coming to save you. We are going to erase you from the face of the earth, and tomorrow night we will drink vintage champagne and celebrate the survival of the Hawthorne legacy." They stood united in their blinding arrogance, utterly convinced that their wealth, their underground cleaners, and their signal jammers had successfully neutralized the greatest threat they had ever faced. They were practically vibrating with the intoxicating thrill of their perceived victory. They believed they had silenced my secret weapon and re-established their absolute dominance over my life. They thought I was completely severed from the outside world, a helpless victim trapped in their soundproofed dungeon. They had absolutely no idea that their desperate, panicked scramble to sever the estate wireless connections was the exact precise maneuver I had been patiently waiting for them to execute all along. I simply stared at them, watching them dig their own graves with a quiet, unbothered smile resting comfortably on my face. The quiet, unbothered smile, resting comfortably on my face, slowly blossomed into a genuine, full-throated laugh. The sound bubbled up from deep within my chest, bright and melodic, cutting through the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the study like a shattering pane of glass. It was not the frantic, hysterical laughter of a woman who had just been cornered by a family of ruthless billionaires. It was the rich, deeply amused laughter of someone who had just watched her opponents walk blindly into a perfectly laid snare. My laughter echoed against the dark mahogany walls, causing the triumphant energy in the room to instantly curdle. Beatrice froze mid-step, the haughty, arrogant smirk sliding off her perfectly structured face. She stared at me, as if I had suddenly grown a second head. Camilla took a nervous step backward, her manicured hands dropping away from her hips. The confident musical lilt she had used just moments ago completely vanished, replaced by a sudden creeping unease. Even Preston lost his arrogant swagger, his broad shoulders tensing as he looked around the room trying to locate the source of my sudden, inexplicable amusement. Harrison gripped the edge of his massive wooden desk, his knuckles turning a stark bone white. The heavy black handgun he had lowered just minutes earlier twitched in his hand, though he did not raise it again. The absolute certainty he had projected when he activated his military-grade signal. Jammer began to crack, fracturing under the weight of my unyielding confidence. "What exactly do you find so amusing?" Harrison demanded. His voice was a harsh, gravelly bark, but it lacked the terrifying booming authority it had commanded earlier in the evening. "There is absolutely nothing funny about your current situation, Savannah. You are entirely isolated. Your digital tether to the outside world has been completely severed. You have lost this game. Stop acting like you hold any remaining cards." I let my laughter subside into a soft, highly entertained chuckle. I shook my head slowly, looking at the patriarch of the Hawthorne Empire with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disdain. "I am laughing because your arrogance has made you dangerously predictable." "Harrison," I replied, my voice echoing clearly in the sudden, deafening silence of the soundproofed study. "I am laughing because you are a man who built a massive international financial syndicate, yet you still think like a local street thug who thinks cutting the telephone wires will stop the police from arriving." I raised my left arm, holding my wrist up, so the matte black face of my smartwatch caught the dim light cast by the brass reading lamps. The small digital screen was no longer flashing the bright yellow warning light that indicated a severed local connection. Instead, the interface had shifted to a deep pulsing crimson. "You truly believed you had outsmarted me," I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the room. "You engaged a localized electromagnetic jammer and shut down the estate wireless internet and cellular networks. You proudly announced that we were sitting inside a complete digital void." I paused, letting my gaze sweep over the terrified faces of my in-laws. I looked directly at Harrison. "Did you honestly think a senior forensic accountant, a federal contractor tasked with tracking billions of dollars in highly encrypted international money laundering networks, would rely on your basic residential internet connection to transmit classified evidence of treason?" Harrison stared at me, his chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. The color continued to drain from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I tapped the crimson screen of my watch with my right index finger. "My equipment is not available for purchase at a consumer electronics store." I informed them, my tone dropping into a cold, clinical register. "This device does not search for local cell towers. It does not look for commercial broadband signals. It is a highly classified military-grade tactical transceiver. It is directly permanently linked to a secure, low-Earth orbit military communications satellite provided explicitly by the United States Department of Defense." Beatrice let out a sharp, choked gasp. She reached out blindly, grabbing the sleeve of her husband's tuxedo jacket to steady herself. Her knees seemed to buckle slightly under the crushing weight of this new, terrifying revelation. "Your underground signal jammer is designed to block commercial frequencies and standard cellular bands," I explained, walking them through the agonizing mechanics of their own destruction. "It is completely incapable of interfering with a direct encrypted satellite uplink. In fact, Harrison, your panicked decision to kill the local network traffic was incredibly helpful to my operation." I stopped pacing and stood perfectly still, letting my next words land with devastating, irreversible impact. "By shutting down the estate wireless routers and blocking the cellular traffic from the hundreds of guests down in the ballroom, you actually cleared the local frequency spectrum. You removed all the ambient digital noise and interference. You gave my device a crystal clear, completely unobstructed pathway to the sky." Preston let out a low, terrified groan. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, dragging them down his face, as the absolute reality of their doom washed over him. They had not trapped me in a digital void. They had unwittingly handed me the perfect silent environment needed to finalize their execution. I looked down at the face of my watch. The screen had transitioned from pulsing crimson to a bright, steady, and brilliant blue. A small, highly detailed progress bar stretched across the center of the digital display. It was a visual representation of the massive encrypted data packet moving securely through the atmosphere. You claim that massive encrypted ledgers take significant time to upload, I said, looking back up at the broken, trembling family. You were absolutely correct about that, Harrison. That is precisely why I initiated the background transfer the very moment Liam and I stepped onto your property this evening. The presentation I projected onto your wall was just a distraction. It was a visual prop designed to keep all of you focused on me, while my device quietly handled the heavy lifting in the background. Camilla let out a high-pitched, frantic sob. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently, as she finally understood that there was no underground crisis team coming to save her. There was no amount of money that could reverse a direct military transmission. The final undeniable piece of evidence just required a simple manual confirmation code to authorize the release, I stated, bringing my wrist up between us so they could all see the glowing blue screen. A confirmation code that I typed into this interface exactly 5 minutes ago, right before you so helpfully cleared the airspace for me. I watched the small bright line on the progress bar inch closer and closer to the right edge of the screen. 97%, 98%, 99%. Harrison dropped the heavy handgun onto the polished mahogany desk. The weapon landed with a dull, heavy thud that sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. He collapsed into his high-backed leather executive chair, his eyes wide and vacant, staring blankly at nothing. The invincible patriarch of the Hawthorne dynasty was completely, irrevocably broken. The smartwatch on my wrist let out a single sharp, high-pitched electronic chime. The progress bar vanished, replaced by a solid bright green checkmark that illuminated the dark space between us. A block of stark white text appeared beneath the checkmark, confirming the absolute end of their reign. Transmission complete, I read aloud, my voice ringing with unwavering, absolute finality. The data packet has been successfully received, decrypted, and authenticated by the federal servers in Washington. The final command sequence has been officially verified. The signal has been sent. Liam stood perfectly still beside me, his broad shoulders relaxed for the first time since we had been forced into this soundproofed room. He simply watched his family absorb the full devastating reality of their absolute defeat. He had known about the satellite uplink, of course. We had meticulously planned every single contingency for this operation. But seeing it executed flawlessly, watching the arrogant billionaires who had tormented me for 5 long years finally realize they were completely powerless, brought a profound sense of quiet justice to the space between us. The heavy, oppressive silence returned to the study, but this time it was not the silence of a trapped victim. It was the total, agonizing silence of a family waiting for the inevitable crushing blow of justice to shatter their front doors. They had lost absolutely everything, and there was nowhere left to run. The massive iron gates they had locked to keep us inside would soon be torn open by federal agents. The perfect social event happening downstairs was about to become the most public, humiliating downfall in the long, corrupt history of American high society. The heavy, suffocating silence in the study was finally broken by Harrison. He slowly pushed himself up from his leather executive chair, his movements stiff and uncoordinated. He looked at Liam with a desperate, pleading expression that completely erased his former terrifying authority. He still believed his son was just a pawn who had been manipulated by a clever woman. "Liam, you have to stop this right now," Harrison begged, his voice cracking under the immense strain of his panic. "Call your agency contacts. Tell them this is a massive misunderstanding. Tell them Savannah is acting independently and has suffered a psychotic break. You are a highly respected consultant. They will listen to you. Fix this before those agents breach our front doors." Beatrice rushed forward, her sapphire gown rustling loudly. She grabbed Liam by the arm, her manicured fingers digging into his tuxedo. "Please, Liam," she pleaded, tears of terror streaming down her face. "We are your family. You cannot let this street rat destroy everything your grandfather ever built. Please save us." Liam did not pull away from his mother. He stood still. The defensive posture he had maintained all evening dissolved, replaced by an aura of terrifying calm. He looked down at his mother, then shifted his gaze to his father. "I am not going to call anyone to stop this," Liam said. His voice was steady, carrying a resonance that echoed off the walls. "And I am not a consultant." He reached into the breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket. Harrison let out a breath, assuming his son was reaching for a mobile phone to call a fixer. Instead, Liam withdrew a black leather credential case. With a swift flick of his wrist, he let the case fall open. The polished silver badge inside caught the dim light gleaming with undeniable authority. Preston stumbled forward, his eyes squinting as he tried to read the engraved lettering on the metal shield. He let out a strangled gasp. It was not a standard identification card. It was the highest-level credential issued by the federal government. "I am the director of the Joint Transnational Financial Crimes Task Force," Liam announced, his words landing in the quiet room. "I operate under a classified mandate from the Central Intelligence Agency and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I do not consult on risk assessment. I hunt international criminals." The devastating truth hung in the air. Beatrice released his arm as if she had been burned. She backed away from him, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Camilla let out a terrified whimper and sank onto the floor. They had spent decades building an untouchable syndicate, paying off politicians and hiring attorneys. Now they were staring at their own flesh and blood, realizing he was the highest-ranking federal agent they had ever encountered. "You are a federal agent," Harrison whispered, his voice entirely devoid of its former booming confidence. "You have been investigating your own blood. Why would you do this to us, Liam? We gave you everything." Liam looked at his father with an expression of unyielding disgust. "I am doing this exactly because you are my blood," Liam replied coldly. "I grew up watching you destroy innocent lives. I watched you bankrupt families, bribe politicians, and steal from people who trusted you. You thought you were grooming me to take over a corporate empire. You were really giving me a front-row seat to a ruthless criminal enterprise. I did not join the agency to protect the Hawthorne name. I joined to burn it to the ground. I spent 15 years building a specialized task force for the sole purpose of dismantling your entire operation." Preston shook his head violently, refusing to accept the reality of their destruction. He pointed a finger at me. "But she is the one who hacked our servers," Preston shouted. "She stole the ledgers. You let this foster child manipulate you. You let her use your access to destroy your own family." Liam let out a short, humorless laugh that held absolutely no warmth. He reached out and gently took my hand, lacing his fingers securely through mine. "You still do not understand a single thing about what is happening here, do you?" Liam asked, looking at his brother with profound pity. "Savannah did not manipulate me into doing anything. I am the one who recruited her." The shock on their faces was absolute. Beatrice covered her mouth, her eyes darting between us in horror. "Savannah and I are not just husband and wife who stumbled into your dirty secrets," Liam explained, squeezing my hand with a fierce pride. "We are a covert tactical team. When I realized your offshore accounts were hidden behind layers of illegal firewalls, I knew I needed the best forensic accountant in the country to crack them open. I found Savannah working deep undercover for the federal government. I brought her onto my task force and we built this entire operation together." Harrison gripped the desk so hard his hands began to shake. "You married her just to get her inside my house," Harrison demanded, his voice cracking under the immense strain of his realization. "I married her because she is the most brilliant, resilient, and remarkable woman I have ever met," Liam corrected sharply, his eyes flashing with sudden protective anger. "I love her with everything I have, but I absolutely used your elitist family dinners to get her close to your servers. Every single time you invited us over for Sunday roast, every time you forced us to attend your miserable holiday parties, we were running a synchronized, highly classified operation right under your noses." I smiled, remembering the times we had played our parts to absolute perfection. I stepped forward, taking over the explanation. "While you were busy insulting my clothes, mocking my upbringing, and telling your wealthy friends I was just a tragic charity case, Liam was expertly distracting your private security guards. He would engage them in casual conversation about sports or luxury cars, intentionally creating blind spots in the camera coverage. That gave me the exact 3-minute window I needed to slip into your private office, plug a bypass drive into your secure router, and copy your encrypted ledgers." Camilla let out a loud, hysterical sob from her place on the floor, She pressed her hands against her face. "You sat at our dinner table," Camilla cried, her voice muffled by tears. "You ate our food. You smiled at us while you were planning to lock us all in a cage." Liam did not offer her a single ounce of sympathy. "I smiled at you because it was my job," he replied coldly. "And you made my job incredibly easy. Your arrogance was your greatest, most fatal vulnerability. You were all so deeply convinced that Savannah was entirely beneath you. You were so completely obsessed with putting her in her place that you never once stopped to wonder why a federal intelligence agent was bringing her around your highly illegal financial hub. You were so intensely focused on the brand of her shoes that you missed the military-grade hacking equipment hidden inside her purse." Harrison let his head fall back against the executive chair. He finally understood the absolute, inescapable reality of his situation. His own son had spent 15 years orchestrating his downfall. His own son had brought the executioner right through the front doors, expertly disguised as a timid, unworthy bride. They had been completely outplayed, outsmarted, and outmaneuvered on every conceivable level. Their money, their power, and their ruthless tactics meant nothing against a team that had patiently waited 5 years to strike. "You are a traitor to your blood," Beatrice whispered, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. Liam stood tall, his posture reflecting the absolute justice he dedicated his life to serving. "I am a federal agent," he stated firmly, "and I am finally cleaning up the toxic mess this family created." The finality of Liam's words struck the room like a physical blow. Beatrice sank against the mahogany, her hands gripping the wood to stay tethered to the earth. The illusion of her untouchable dynasty was shattered, reduced to a crime syndicate, outmaneuvered by her son. Camilla was sobbing openly, her malicious glee replaced by raw terror as she realized her wealth could no longer shield her. Liam did not give them a single second to recover their shattered composure. He reached his hand deep into the inner breast pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket. When he withdrew his hand, he was holding the small, clear glass vial he had used down in the ballroom. He held the vial up, pinching it between his thumb and forefinger, so that every member of his corrupt family could see it clearly. "You thought you were incredibly clever tonight, Camilla," Liam said, his voice dropping into a cold register that commanded attention. "You thought slipping a military-grade hallucinogen into vintage champagne was a brilliant strategy to eliminate a threat to your inheritance. You thought you could induce a psychological break and force me to commit her to a psychiatric facility to protect my security clearance." Camilla let out a high-pitched whine, pressing her hands over her face as she shrank away from the small glass vial. Liam took a slow, deliberate step toward her, forcing her to confront the physical evidence of her malicious intent. "But you made a catastrophic error," Liam continued, his tone unyielding. "You attempted to drug a federal intelligence contractor during an active, highly classified operation. You did not just try to harm your sister-in-law. You attempted to permanently incapacitate a key federal witness who was in the process of gathering evidence against a transnational money laundering syndicate." Harrison let out a ragged, desperate breath from his executive chair. He looked at the vial, the last remnants of his arrogant defiance draining completely from his face. "Possession of a synthesized neurotoxin is a severe federal offense," Liam explained, sweeping his eyes across the broken family. "But when you combine that with conspiracy to frame an innocent woman, corporate fraud, and the attempted poisoning of a federal operative and his primary witness, the charges escalate exponentially. This single vial of champagne does not just prove your malicious intent. It is the final nail in your coffin. You just added 20 consecutive years to your mandatory federal sentences." Beatrice let out an agonizing wail. She collapsed onto her knees, the heavy silk of her sapphire gown pooling around her on the thick carpet. She reached out toward Liam, grasping desperately at the air. "Liam, please," Beatrice begged, her voice thick with tears and undeniable panic. "We are your blood. We gave you your life. You cannot let them put us in a federal prison. You have to destroy that vial. You have to tell them we cooperated." Liam looked down at his mother, his expression entirely devoid of pity or hesitation. "My blood does not poison innocent people to protect stolen money," Liam replied softly. "You made your choices, Beatrice. Now you get to experience the exact helplessness you inflicted on thousands of hardworking people when you drained their pension funds to finance this estate." I stepped forward, moving to stand aligned with my husband. The time for explaining the intricate details of their downfall was officially over. I raised my left arm, turning the face of my smartwatch toward the ceiling. The interface was glowing with a brilliant green light, indicating that the massive data packet containing decades of their financial crimes had been successfully authenticated by the authorities in Washington. Harrison suddenly jerked forward in his chair. He looked frantically toward the heavily curtained windows, his eyes wide with a sudden dawning realization. The front gates. Harrison stammered, his voice hoarse and trembling. The gates are still locked. The perimeter is secured by the magnetic locks. We still have time to call the crisis team. We can barricade the house. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. I tapped the screen of my watch, accessing the localized network that I had bypassed earlier. You really do not understand the level of control I have over your life right now, Harrison, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet study. Your signal jammer blocked your own internal systems, but it did not block my satellite uplink. And now that my primary transmission is complete, I am using your own internal security framework against you. I typed a swift, simple command sequence into my digital interface. A loud electronic chirp resonated through the hidden ceiling speakers. It was the exact same tone that had sounded when Harrison locked the estate down earlier, but this time it signaled the total surrender of his fortress. I just overrode your entire security mainframe, I announced. I disabled your magnetic perimeter locks. I deactivated the alarm sensors on every single door and window in this mansion. I just threw your massive iron gates wide open to the public street. As if responding to my words, a deep rhythmic vibration began to pulse beneath our feet. It started as a faint hum, but it grew rapidly in intensity, shaking the crystal glasses on a side table and causing the reading lamps to rattle softly against the bookshelves. Preston spun around, staring at the heavy velvet curtains that covered the large windows. "What is that noise?" Preston demanded, his voice cracking with pure, unfiltered panic. The heavy rhythmic thumping grew louder, vibrating in the center of my chest. It was the unmistakable sound of helicopter blades chopping violently through the cool night air. The federal authorities were not just sending a few local agents to knock on the front door. They were executing a massive tactical raid on one of the most corrupt financial syndicates in the country. Suddenly, the sharp wail of countless sirens tore through the exclusive Hamptons neighborhood. The sound multiplied and echoed, overlapping into a deafening chorus of approaching justice. Blinding flashes of red and blue light began to strobe aggressively through the narrow gaps in the heavy velvet curtains, painting the dark mahogany walls of the study in chaotic rotating colors. Liam reached out and pulled the heavy curtains apart, exposing the massive windows. We looked down at the sprawling front lawn of the Hawthorne estate. It was a scene of absolute tactical dominance. Dozens of heavily armored federal vehicles were flooding through the open iron gates, tires screeching against the pristine circular driveway. The vehicles swarmed the property, forming a tight, impenetrable perimeter around the mansion. Hundreds of armed federal agents wearing tactical gear and windbreakers, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI, poured out of the vehicles. They moved with swift, terrifying precision, establishing control points and securing every exit. Two large helicopters hovered low over the expansive back lawns, their searchlights sweeping across the property and illuminating the fleeing faces of the private security guards who were desperately trying to escape. We could hear the sheer panic erupting from the grand ballroom below us. The muffled screams of the elite, untouchable guests drifted up through the floorboards. The politicians, wealthy investors, and high society socialites who had mocked me were now being forcefully detained, corralled, and subjected to immediate federal questioning. The glamorous summer gala had been instantly transformed into the largest, most humiliating crime scene in modern American history. Harrison staggered to the window, pressing his trembling hands against the glass. He stared down at the flashing lights, the armed agents, and the absolute destruction of his flawless, carefully cultivated empire. His knees gave out, and he collapsed against the window frame, sliding down the glass until he was kneeling on the floor, a broken, defeated man staring at the lights of his own personal apocalypse. "It is over," Liam said, looking down at his father with a cold expression of absolute justice. Before Harrison could formulate a single defensive response, the heavy oak doors of the quiet study were violently breached. The reinforced oak wood splintered loudly under the sheer force of a tactical battering ram. The doors swung inward with a crash, hitting the bookshelves so hard that volumes tumbled onto the thick carpet. A dozen heavily armed federal agents poured into the room, weapons drawn, their flashlights cutting through the dim gloom. The atmosphere instantly transformed into a chaotic arrest operation. The agents moved with terrifying efficiency, shouting commands that left absolutely no room for negotiation. "Get your hands where we can see them," the lead agent roared, his voice echoing off the mahogany. "Do it right now." Harrison did not move from the floor. He simply raised his trembling hands, his eyes vacant and devoid of the arrogant spark that had defined his existence. Two agents converged on him, forcing him flat against the carpet. The metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists sounded like a final death knell for the Hawthorne Empire. Preston, who had spent the evening boasting and mocking my background, completely lost his nerve. He let out a pathetic whimper and dropped to his knees, offering his hands up in a cowardly display of submission. Camilla screamed a wild sound as an agent grabbed her arms and secured them behind her back. Her designer gown was now horribly wrinkled, her blonde hair falling in tangled clumps across her tear-stained face. Beatrice was the last to be restrained. She stood rigidly by the desk, clinging to the fading illusion of her aristocratic power. When the agent grabbed her wrists, she tried to pull away. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill with indignant rage. "I am Beatrice Hawthorne. You cannot treat me like a common criminal." The agent did not pause to acknowledge her elite status. He simply secured the handcuffs with a sharp, unforgiving click. "You are a federal suspect, Mom," the agent replied coldly. "You have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you start using it immediately." Liam and I stepped aside, giving the tactical team space to secure the room. A senior agent approached Liam, giving him a brief nod before turning his attention to the prisoners. "It is time to clear the premises," the senior agent announced. "Move them downstairs." The four billionaires were roughly hauled to their feet. They looked completely disoriented, stripped of their wealth and their terrifying authority. They were just four frightened criminals being marched out of their own private sanctuary. Liam placed a gentle hand on my back, guiding me out of the study so we could follow. We walked behind the agents as they escorted the Hawthorne family down the long carpeted corridor of the second floor. The journey to the grand staircase felt like a slow, deliberate funeral march. When we reached the top of the marble stairs, the full reality of their public downfall came into glorious view. The grand ballroom below was no longer a scene of glittering elegance. The string quartet had long since stopped playing. Hundreds of wealthy politicians, elite investors, and high society socialites were now completely silent, standing in shocked groups behind a perimeter established by federal agents. Every single eye in the massive foyer was directed upward. The crowd watched in absolute, paralyzing horror as the untouchable Hawthorne family was paraded down the sweeping staircase in handcuffs. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the heavy thud of the agents marching in their tactical boots. I stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the very people who had spent the entire evening whispering about my cheap dress and my lack of proper breeding. I watched the society women who had laughed at Beatrice and her cruel jokes now covering their mouths in sheer disbelief. The wealthy men who had eagerly taken Harrison and his investment advice were now furiously typing on their phones, desperately trying to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Beatrice tried to keep her head held high, but the burning shame of the public spectacle was too much for her to bear. She lowered her chin, her silver hair hiding her face as she avoided the judgmental stares. Preston kept his eyes squeezed shut, unable to face the reality of his total humiliation. Camilla sobbed openly, the sound echoing pathetically in the silent foyer. Harrison looked like a hollow shell shuffling forward with blank, unseeing eyes. The illusion of their superiority had been violently, permanently shattered in front of the very audience they cared about most. They had been completely exposed as frauds and ruthless predators. Liam and I did not follow them down to the foyer. We stepped away from the staircase and walked through open French doors that led out onto the second-floor balcony. The cool, refreshing night air washed over my face, carrying the salty scent of the nearby ocean. We stood side by side at the stone railing, looking down at the chaotic scene unfolding on the manicured front lawn. The flashing red and blue lights of armored federal vehicles painted the dark landscape in a rotating, dizzying display of justice. We watched as federal agents loaded Harrison Beatrice Preston and Camilla into separate unmarked transport vans. The heavy doors slammed shut with a finality that resonated deep within my chest. The vans pulled away, joining a long convoy of law enforcement vehicles streaming out through the massive iron gates that I had forced open just moments ago. I let out a slow breath, feeling the crushing, invisible weight of 5 years of psychological torment finally lifting off my shoulders. They had tried to make me feel small, worthless, and entirely dependent on their mercy. They had tried to erase me from existence to protect their stolen fortune. But standing on that balcony wrapped in the safe, protective embrace of my husband, I knew they had failed completely. They had lost their wealth, their freedom, and their prestigious name forever. We had won. 6 months later, the toxic Hamptons estate was nothing more than a fading memory. Liam and I were sitting on a sun-drenched terrace, overlooking the breathtaking turquoise waters of the Amalfi Coast in Italy. The warm Mediterranean breeze gently ruffled the pages of the book resting on my lap. Liam walked out carrying 2 tall glasses of freshly squeezed lemonade. He smiled, handing me one of the glasses without a single drop of cloudy residue at the bottom. The federal trials had moved quickly, fueled by the overwhelming mountain of digital evidence. Since I had successfully transmitted that night. Harrison, Beatrice Preston, and Camilla had all pleaded guilty to avoid a lengthy, highly publicized trial. They were currently serving long consecutive sentences in separate federal penitentiaries. As I took a sip, a soft electronic chime sounded from the tablet resting beside me. I picked up the device, opening a notification from my private legal counsel. I read the message, a slow, deeply satisfied smile spreading across my face. The bank had officially finalized the foreclosure on the Hawthorne family estate in the Hamptons. Using the substantial multi-million-dollar federal reward money I had earned for dismantling their international money laundering syndicate, I had purchased the property at auction for absolute pennies on the dollar. I had just signed the final legally binding paperwork to completely renovate the massive $30 million mansion. The luxurious estate where Beatrice had once mocked my upbringing was being entirely converted into a fully funded state-of-the-art educational support center and residential shelter for children transitioning out of the foster care system. The untouchable Hawthorne legacy had been completely erased, replaced by a sanctuary for the exact same kind of vulnerable, orphan children they had always despised. It was a sweet, absolute, and perfectly poetic victory for the resilient woman they had carelessly labeled as the family black sheep. The greatest lesson I learned from dismantling the Hawthorne empire is that true power has absolutely nothing to do with inherited wealth. For years, they looked down on me because I grew up in the foster system. They believed their money made them untouchable, and my lack of pedigree made me an easy target. But arrogance is a blinding disease. It makes you underestimate the quiet ones in the room. They spent so much time mocking my clothes that they never bothered to look at the brilliant mind underneath. Resilience is a weapon that trust funds simply cannot buy. When you build your own life from the ground up, you learn how to survive in environments that would completely break the elite. I also learned that true family is defined by loyalty, not by bloodlines. Liam proved that by standing with me against his own corrupt parents. If you are ever made to feel small by people who think they are superior, remember that their cruelty reflects their own fragile insecurities. Keep your head high, work hard in silence, and trust your own strength. Have you ever had to outsmart people who severely underestimated your worth? Share your stories of personal victory in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about claiming your power. Remember that your past does not define your future, and sometimes the best way to win the game is to flip the entire board.